Who bought you those flowers? Nathan Calloway's voice was quiet, and quiet was worse than shouting, and Grace knew it. He'd walked into her office, shut the door, and turned the lock with 2 fingers before he'd said a single word. Now he stood between her and the only way out, 4 dozen blood-red roses bleeding across her desk, and he wanted a name. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. The most feared man in Chicago had just locked her in a room over a bouquet. And Grace understood in that instant that tonight everything between them would either break or begin. If you love stories about strong women, dangerous men, and secrets that refuse to stay buried, subscribe to this channel and stay with me all the way to the end, because this story will surprise you more than once. And do me a favor while you're here. Comment the name of the city where you're watching from right now, so I can see how far this story has traveled tonight. Now let's begin. The building was nearly empty at 6:17 on that stormy Monday evening. Most of the offices at Calloway Freight and Harbor had gone dark an hour earlier, the desks abandoned, the elevators quiet. The whole 34th floor, holding its breath the way tall buildings do when a storm rolls in off the lake. Rain slapped the glass in long gray sheets. Grace Bennett barely noticed. She had a report to finish, and she was the kind of woman who finished what she started. She was 31 years old, and she had the numbers of an entire shipping empire spread out in front of her. Grace was the financial director of Calloway Freight, which meant she knew where every dollar went, where every dollar came from, and more importantly, where a few of those dollars had quietly vanished over the last several months. That was the report she was building tonight. An emergency audit. The kind you don't put in an email, the kind you print once, read twice, and lock in a drawer. She had just typed a number that made her stomach tighten when she heard the elevator chime down the hall. Grace looked up. Nobody should have been coming up at this hour. She waited, listening, and instead of footsteps, she heard wheels. A soft rolling sound like a cart. A moment later, a young courier in a rain-soaked jacket appeared at her open office door, pushing a delivery cart. And on that cart sat the largest arrangement of roses Grace had ever seen in her life. "Delivery for Grace Bennett," the young man said. Grace stared at the flowers. There had to be 4 dozen of them, deep red, almost black in the low light, packed so tightly they looked like a single living thing. "I think you have the wrong floor," she said. "Nobody sends me flowers." Grace Bennett, 34th floor, corner office. The courier read off his tablet. "That's you, ma'am. Who sent them?" The young man shrugged. "There's a card. That's all I got." Grace signed for the delivery only because it was easier than arguing. She watched him wheel the card in, set the enormous arrangement on the edge of her desk, and leave. She heard the elevator take him back down. Then she was alone again, alone with a mountain of roses and the sound of the rain, and she felt, for reasons she couldn't yet name, that something in the room had gone wrong. She looked for the card. It was tucked deep among the stems, and it wasn't the small white card florists use. It was black, heavy paper, the kind used for invitations to things you don't want to attend. Grace pulled it free, turned it over, and read the 5 words printed there in silver. "Ask Nathan about Pier 9. Grace felt her breath change. No signature, no name, no little heart, no thinking of you, no admirer real or imagined. Just those 5 words, and they landed in her chest like a hand closing around it. Because Grace knew that name. Pier 9. She had seen it exactly once, buried in a set of old company records she wasn't supposed to be reading, a warehouse that had been scrubbed off the books after a fire 12 years ago. A fire that had killed several men. A fire nobody at Calloway Freight would talk about. Not the old-timers, not the lawyers, and certainly not Nathan Calloway himself. Somebody had just put that name in her hands, wrapped in 4 dozen roses, and delivered it to her locked corner office after everyone else had gone home. Grace set the card down very carefully as if it might go off. She reached for her phone. She wasn't sure who she was going to call. Security, maybe. Or maybe she was just holding it, because holding something made her feel less like the walls were closing in. And that was the exact moment she heard the elevator again. This time there were footsteps, heavy ones, unhurried. And every instinct, Grace had told her who they belonged to before he ever came into view. Nathan Calloway walked onto the 34th floor, still wearing the storm. His coat was dark with rain, his hair pushed back wet from his forehead, and he moved the way he always moved, like a man who had never once in his life had to hurry because the world hurried for him. He'd been down at the docks. He was always down at the docks lately, and Grace had learned not to ask why. The few people still in the building went silent as he passed. A cleaning woman by the copy room stopped her cart. A junior analyst at the far desk suddenly found his screen fascinating. That was the effect Nathan had on a room. He didn't have to raise his voice or make a threat. People simply lowered their eyes, the way you do around something you respect and fear in equal measure. He was 38, and he ran an empire he had inherited in blood. On paper, Calloway Freight and Harbor was one of the largest shipping and logistics companies on the Great Lakes. Off paper, in the rooms Grace was not so supposed to know about, it was something else, something older and darker, a name whispered in certain neighborhoods with real weight behind it. Grace had taken the job 3 years ago because the salary was extraordinary and the work was interesting. She had stayed because, somewhere in that time, the most dangerous man in Chicago had started looking at her like she was the only honest thing left in his world. She had never once let him see that she noticed. Nathan reached her doorway, and he stopped. Grace watched his face change. It happened fast, but she caught it, because she had learned to read this man the way she read a balance sheet, watching for the one entry that didn't belong. His eyes went to the roses, 4 dozen of them, red as a wound, sitting on her desk, and something in him went cold and still and dark all at once. He stepped into her office. He didn't ask permission. He never did. But instead of speaking, he closed the door behind him, and reached down and turned the lock. The click was small. In that quiet office, it sounded enormous. Grace stood up. Nathan, he didn't touch her. That was the strange part, the part she would remember later. He never laid a finger on her. He simply stood there between her and the door, a big man in a wet coat, and the anger coming off him made the whole room feel smaller, made the air feel thinner, made the roses on her desk look less like a gift and more like a body at a wake. "Who bought you those flowers?" he asked. His voice was so quiet she almost couldn't hear it over the rain. Grace felt her pulse jump, and she felt something else too, something hotter. She was afraid, yes. Any sensible person would be afraid, locked in a room with a man like Nathan Calloway when his jaw was set like that. But underneath the fear was something that refused to bow. She had spent her whole life refusing to bow. She wasn't going to start tonight. "I don't know," she said. "Don't lie to me. I'm not lying to you." She lifted her chin. "A courier brought them 10 minutes ago. No name. I signed for them because I thought it was easier than sending them back. And I would appreciate it, Nathan, if you would unlock that door." He took a step closer. "Somebody sent 4 dozen roses to my building, to my floor, to your office, and you expect me to believe you don't know who. I expect you to believe me because I'm telling you the truth." Grace didn't back up. She wanted to. Every animal instinct in her body wanted to put the desk between them. She held her ground instead, because she understood something about this man that maybe no one else in the building did. Nathan Calloway did not respect people who ran from him. He'd spent his whole life surrounded by people who ran from him. The only currency he truly valued was the thing almost no one would give him, which was a person who looked him in the eye and did not flinch. So she looked him in the eye, and she did not flinch. "There's a card," she said. "Read it yourself." That got through. Something flickered across his face. He glanced down, saw the black card lying on the desk beside the flowers, and Grace watched him reach for it. She saw the exact moment he read the 5 words. She would think about that moment for a long time afterward, because for one full second, the anger drained completely out of Nathan Calloway's face, and what replaced it was something she had never seen there before. Not in 3 years, not once. She had seen him cold. She had seen him furious. She had seen him charming in a way that frightened her more than his anger, because it was so practiced. But she had never seen him afraid. He was afraid now. His hand tightened on the card. The muscle in his jaw jumped, and his eyes, when they came back up to hers, had changed entirely. The jealous man who had locked the door was gone. In his place was somebody bracing for a blow. "Where did this come from?" he said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a demand, low and dangerous. "I told you, a courier." What did he look like? 20s, rain jacket. I didn't recognize him. Grace reached out and, before he could stop her, plucked the card out of his hand. He let her take it, which told her more than anything else could have. This man did not let people take things from him, Nathan. "What is Pier 9? He didn't answer, Nathan. "Leave it alone, Grace." "I can't leave it alone. Somebody delivered that name to me. To me. Which means somebody has decided I'm part of whatever this is, whether I want to be or not." She held the card up between them. "So I think I've earned an answer. What is Pier 9? For a long moment, the only sound was the rain. Nathan looked at her and she watched him fight some private war behind his eyes. And finally, he said the thing she suspected had never once passed his lips in that building. "It's where my father was killed." The words landed and settled. "There was a fire," he went on, and his voice had gone flat, The way a man's voice goes flat when he's holding something so heavy he can't afford to feel the weight of it. 12 years ago, a warehouse we owned. It burned to the ground one night with men still inside it. My father was one of them. The company took the property off the books afterward, made it disappear. As far as the world is concerned, Pier 9 never existed. But it did exist. It existed. His eyes went to the roses again, and the coldness came back into them, but it was a different cold now. Focused. And somebody just proved to me that they can reach you. Inside my own building, past my own people. On the one floor in this city I thought was safe. He looked at her. You understand what these flowers are, Grace? They're not a threat to you. They're a message to me. There's somebody telling me they can put a hand on the thing I care about, anytime they want, and I won't see them coming. Grace stood very still, because there it was. The thing he'd said without meaning to say it. The thing I care about. He heard it a half second after she did, and she watched him realize it, watched the flush of it move through him, and for the first time in 3 years, Nathan Calloway looked like he wanted to take words back. She should have let it go. It would have been safer to let it go. But Grace Bennett had never once done the safe thing when the true thing was standing right in front of her. You were angry before you read that card, she said quietly. He said nothing. You walked in, you saw the flowers, and you locked the door before you knew a single thing about who sent them or why. She set the card down. That wasn't about Pier 9, Nathan. You didn't know about Pier 9 yet. You locked that door because somebody sent me roses and you couldn't stand it. Grace. The rain filled the silence. No, he said finally. You're not wrong. And then because she had cornered him, because she had backed the most dangerous man in Chicago into the one place he could not fight his way out of, which was the truth, Nathan Calloway told her. You want to know why I locked the door, he said. I'll tell you. For 3 years I have watched men look at you, in meetings, at the docks, at every dinner this company has ever thrown. I've watched them notice you, and I've watched myself do nothing about it, because you work for me, and because I told myself that the smartest thing I could do, the only safe thing, was to keep you at a distance. His voice dropped. And tonight I walk in and there are 4 dozen roses on your desk, from a man whose name you claim not to know, and something in me just stopped working. I locked that door before my brain caught up with my hand. That's the truth. You want it, there it is. It was, Grace realized, probably the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her, and it changed nothing about what she had to do next. Nathan, she said, and she kept her voice steady and kind and completely without fear, because kindness without fear was the only language this man had never learned to argue with. I understand more than you think I do. I know what it costs you to say that. I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it, but you locked a door with me on the wrong side of it. She let that sit. You can protect this building. You can protect the docks, the accounts, the company, the name, all of it. I've watched you do it, and you're better at it than anyone I've ever seen. But you do not own the people inside it. You don't own me. And the moment you decide that keeping me safe means keeping me locked in a room, you stop being the man protecting me, and you become the thing you're protecting me from. She watched that land. She watched it hurt. Unlock the door, she said. He didn't move. Nathan, unlock the door. It was the longest 3 seconds of Grace's life. She stood there in her own office, 4 dozen funeral red roses on the desk between them, a dead man's warning printed on a black card, and she waited to find out what kind of man Nathan Calloway really was. Because everything came down to this. Everything that would happen between them for the rest of the story was decided in these 3 seconds, and they both knew it, even if only one of them could have said so out loud. Then Nathan reached over, and he turned the lock, and he opened the door. The sound of the empty office floor drifted in. The rain, the hum of the vents, the ordinary world. Grace let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Thank you, she said. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Whatever had happened in that locked room had changed something between them, and they both felt it, and neither of them was ready to name it. Get your coat, he said finally. I'm not leaving you in this building alone tonight, not with those on your desk. He nodded at the roses. You can hate me for that later. Right now, humor me. I don't hate you, Grace said. Something moved across his face. He turned away before she could read it. They didn't speak in the elevator. Grace watched the numbers count down and thought about the black card in her pocket. Because she'd taken it, she'd slipped it into her coat when he wasn't looking. And she didn't fully understand why, except that some instinct told her this was the beginning of something, and she wanted to hold on to the first piece of it. Somebody had reached into Nathan Calloway's most secure building and put a name in her hands. His father's grave, wrapped in roses. And whoever they were, they had wanted 2 things. They had wanted Nathan to know they could touch her, and they had wanted to watch what he would do about it. They got their answer that night, though not the way Grace expected. Because 2 hours later, after Nathan had put her in a car with a driver he trusted and sent her home, the head of building security called him with a question in his voice that Nathan didn't like at all. The courier who had delivered the roses had scanned a badge to get up to the 34th floor. Every delivery did. It was logged, photographed, time-stamped, standard procedure. Security had pulled the record to identify the young man, expecting a name from a florist delivery service. The badge belonged to a Calloway Freight employee named Daniel Reyes. Nathan knew the name. He'd known the man. Daniel Reyes had worked the night shift at the harbor terminal for 6 years. A quiet guy, reliable, the kind of employee you never think about because he never gives you a reason to. Daniel Reyes had died 3 years ago. Somebody had used a dead man's credentials to walk a warning past every layer of security Nathan had built, straight to the one person he'd been trying and failing not to fall in love with. Somebody inside the company. Somebody with access to badges that should have been deactivated the day their owner was put in the ground. Somebody who knew exactly which desk to send 4 dozen roses to and exactly which grave to name on the card. Nathan sat alone in his penthouse that night, the storm still hammering the windows, and he understood 2 things with total clarity. The first was that whoever was doing this was not on the outside trying to get in. They were already in. They had been in for a long time. And the second thing, the thing that scared him in a way no threat to his own life ever had, was that he had spent 3 years keeping Grace Bennett at a careful distance, telling himself it was for her protection. And it hadn't protected her at all. Somebody had seen straight through him, straight to the one door he'd kept locked even to himself, and they had opened it with a card and a bunch of flowers. The war hadn't started tonight. Nathan finally understood that. It had started long ago, in a fire 12 years back, in a warehouse that officially didn't exist. Tonight was just the first time the enemy had let him see their hand, and they'd used Grace to do it. Nathan looked out at the lightning breaking over the lake, and for the first time in a very long time, the most feared man in Chicago felt something he'd trained himself to never feel again. He felt afraid. Not for himself, for her. The roses were still on Grace's desk the next morning when she came in, and that told her something. It told her the night crew had been afraid to touch them. 4 dozen dead men's roses, and not one person in the building had been willing to be the one to throw them out. Grace stood in her office doorway with her coffee going cold in her hand and understood that everyone here already knew. Maybe not the details, but they knew what Pier 9 meant, and they knew that flowers with that name attached were not the kind of thing you moved without permission. She threw them out herself, every stem. She carried the whole enormous arrangement to the freight elevator and rode it down to the loading dock and dropped it in a dumpster. And she felt better the moment it was gone. What she kept was the black card. That went back in her pocket, where it had spent the night, because Grace had made a decision somewhere around 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. She was going to find out what was happening to this company. Not for Nathan, for herself. Because somebody had decided she was a piece on the board, and Grace Bennett did not intend to be a piece anybody moved. She started with the numbers, because numbers were the one language she trusted completely. And the numbers, when she really looked at them, told a story that made her sick. It took her 3 days. 3 days of pulling records she had every right to pull as financial director, and a few she didn't. 3 days of building a picture out of 10,000 tiny pieces. And when the picture finally came together, Grace sat back in her chair and felt the floor tilt under her. Calloway Freight and Harbor was bleeding money, not in a way that showed up on any statement the board ever saw. It was subtle, spread across dozens of accounts, disguised as 100 ordinary business expenses. But when you laid it all side by side the way Grace had, a pattern emerged, and the pattern was theft. Millions of dollars siphoned out over 18 months through fake repair contracts on ships that had never needed repairs, through insurance claims on cargo that had never been damaged, through containers logged into the system and then quietly rerouted somewhere they didn't belong. And every one of those rerouted containers passed through the same location before it disappeared. Pier 9. Grace stared at the name on her screen for a long time. The warehouse that officially didn't exist. The one that had burned down 12 years ago. The one Nathan had said was scrubbed off the books. It wasn't off the books. It was very much on the books, hidden inside a shell address. And someone was using it right now tonight as the beating heart of an operation stealing this company blind. Whoever was rebuilding Pier 9 wasn't just stealing money. They were rebuilding the exact thing that had killed Nathan's father. The same network, the same routes, in the same place. Grace printed one copy of everything. She read it twice. She locked it in her drawer, and then she went to find Nathan. He was in his office on the top floor when she walked in and set the folder on his desk and told him what she'd found. She watched the color leave his face for the second time in a week. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain." "Show me." She showed him. She walked him through all of it. Every fake contract, every rerouted container, every dollar. And by the end, Nathan Calloway was standing at his window with his back to her, and his hands pressed flat against the glass, and he was very still. And Grace understood that a man like this being still was more dangerous than a man like this shouting. "Somebody inside my company," he said quietly, "is rebuilding the thing that killed my father, in the same warehouse, using his own routes." "Yeah." "For 18 months. "Yes." He turned. "And 3 nights ago, they sent flowers to your desk to make sure I knew it." Grace nodded, and Nathan crossed the room to her. And for a second, she thought he was going to say something about the two of them, about the locked door, about the thing that had passed between them and had not been mentioned since. Instead, he said the thing she should have expected. "You're not staying in that apartment anymore. Not while this is happening. I want you where I can keep people around you." And there it was. Grace felt her whole body brace, because this was the exact moment she'd been afraid of. The moment the man who couldn't stand to see roses on her desk decided that keeping her safe meant putting her somewhere he controlled. She'd watched him lock a door 3 nights ago. She wasn't going to walk willingly into a bigger version of the same room. "No," she said. "Grace, I heard what you're asking. And the answer is no, unless we do this my way." Nathan's jaw tightened. "There isn't a your way. There's a way you stay alive and a way you don't. And the flowers made it very clear which one we're dealing with. Then listen to me carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." Grace stepped closer to him, which surprised him, because everyone else stepped back. "I will stay somewhere secure. I'm not stupid, Nathan. Somebody used a dead man's badge to reach me, and I take that seriously. But I will not be a prisoner. If I agree to this, I have my own room, with a door that I lock from the inside that no one else has a key to. I keep my phone unrestricted. I call whoever I want, whenever I want, and no one screens it. And I can walk out the front door any hour of any day without asking permission from you or anyone who works for you." She held his eyes. "Those are the terms. All 3. You don't get to negotiate them down. You take them exactly as they are, or I go back to my apartment tonight and take my chances." She watched him war with it. She watched everything in him, every instinct of a man who had spent his whole life keeping control, by never surrendering an inch, rise up against what she was asking. And she watched him lose that war, slowly, because underneath all of it was a man who had heard her 3 nights ago when she'd told him he didn't own the people inside his building, and who had, God help him, actually listened. "Your own room," he said, "your own lock. From the inside. Your phone, unrestricted. And you can leave whenever you want. Whenever I want." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "Fine," he said. And Grace realized it might have been the first time in his adult life that he'd agreed to terms instead of setting them. "Fine," she echoed. That was the first sign, though neither of them called it that Nathan Calloway was capable of learning the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. It was a small thing. A room, a lock, a phone. But Grace had spent enough time around powerful men to know that the small concessions are the only ones that mean anything, because they're the only ones that cost. She moved into the fortress that night. That's how she thought of his home, the fortress. A penthouse that took up the top 2 floors of a building he owned outright, with private elevators and men in the lobby and cameras. Grace stopped counting after the first dozen. And in that fortress, over the next 2 weeks, something happened that neither of them had planned for, and neither of them could stop. They started to actually know each other. It happened in pieces, the way it always does. Late at night, when neither of them could sleep, they'd end up in the same room, and the masks they both wore all day would slip a little in the dark. Grace learned things about Nathan Calloway that she was fairly sure no living person knew. She learned he'd been 16 when his mother disappeared. Not died. Disappeared. One morning she was there, and the next she was gone, and no one ever explained it to him, and he'd spent a year believing she'd come back before he finally understood she wasn't going to. "My father never talked about it," Nathan told her one night, staring at nothing. Not once. He just went colder. Like he'd decided that caring about somebody was a door you could close. He'd been 26 when his father was killed in the fire at Pier 9. And somewhere in the 10 years between those two losses, Nathan had learned the lessons father had taught him without ever saying it out loud. Caring about someone was a weakness, a door your enemies could reach through. So you kept it closed. You kept everyone at a distance, and you called it strength, and you never let yourself notice how alone it made you. That's a terrible way to live, Grace said softly. It kept me alive. Being alive isn't the same as living, Nathan. He looked at her when she said that, and something in his face cracked, just slightly, and she saw the 16-year-old boy waiting for a mother who was never coming home. And Nathan learned things about her too. He learned that Grace worked the hours. She worked not out of ambition, but out of duty, that her father had died when she was young, and she'd been holding her family together with her own two hands ever since. He learned she sent money home to her widowed mother every single month, and that she was secretly paying the college tuition of her younger sister, Emma, because there was no one else to do it, and because Grace had decided a long time ago that Emma was going to have the life Grace never got to have. She doesn't know it's me, Grace admitted. She thinks it's a scholarship. I set it up that way. I don't want her to feel like she owes me anything. Why not? Because love that comes with a debt attached isn't love, Grace said. It's ownership. And I'd never do that to her. Nathan went very quiet after that. And Grace understood, watching him, that she'd just described the exact thing he'd been doing his whole life without ever having a word for it. Love that came with a debt. Protection that turned into a cage. He'd been raised by a man who confused the two, and he'd nearly become that man himself. And 3 nights ago, he'd stood in her office and locked a door and felt, for one terrible moment, that he had the right. The war outside the fortress didn't stop while they learned each other. If anything, it sped up. Because Julian Vance had started calling. Grace knew who Julian Vance was before he ever reached out. Everyone in Chicago shipping knew. He was smooth and rich and connected, a man who ran a rival logistics operation with a polished front and, according to rumor, a rotten center. He was the kind of man who wore very expensive suits to hide the fact that he'd do absolutely anything to win. And he had, over the past week, developed a sudden and very intense interest in Grace Bennett. He sent a message first, then flowers of his own, which Grace threw out. Then, finally, an invitation to dinner, and attached to the invitation was a single line that made Grace stop cold. I have proof that Nathan Calloway set the fire at Pier 9 himself. You deserve to know who you're really working for. Grace showed it to Nathan. She watched him read it, and she watched the jealousy come up in him, hot and fast, exactly the way it had the night of the roses. His hand tightened on her phone, his jaw set, and Grace waited, because this was a test, and they both knew it was a test. And how Nathan handled the next 30 seconds would tell her whether the last 2 weeks had meant anything at all. He's lying, Nathan said. Probably. There's no probably. I did not set that fire. That fire killed my father. I believe you, Grace said. But he says he's proof. And whether it's real or fake, I need to see what he's holding. Because if somebody's building a case against you, I'd rather know what's in it than find out later. She watched him understand where this was going. She watched him hate it. You want to meet him, Nathan said. I think I have to. And this was the moment. Grace saw it in his eyes, the same instinct that had turned the lock 3 weeks ago, the pull toward control that was so deep in him, it was almost gravity. She watched him open his mouth to forbid it. And then she watched him close it again and press his knuckles white against the table and physically stop himself. Because somewhere in the last 2 weeks he had learned the fastest way to lose Grace Bennett was to try to keep her. I don't trust him, Nathan said finally, and every word cost him. I think he's dangerous, and I think that dinner is a trap of some kind, and everything in me wants to tell you not to go. He took a breath. But whether you meet him is your decision. Not mine, yours. Grace stood there and felt something shift in her chest, because she knew, better than anyone alive, what those words had cost him. She'd watched him lock a door rather than let another man send her flowers. And now, 3 weeks later, he was standing in his own home, telling her she was free to have dinner with the man actively trying to destroy him, because he had finally understood that her freedom was not his to take. Thank you, she said quietly. I know what that cost you. Do you? I do. And I'll take your security team. I'm not reckless, but I'm going to hear what he has to say. She met Julian Vance 2 nights later at a restaurant so crowded and public that nothing could happen to her there, which was exactly why she'd chosen it. Nathan's men were scattered through the room, close enough to reach her in seconds, and Grace found that knowing they were there didn't make her feel controlled. It made her feel like a woman who had negotiated her own safety on her own terms. There was a difference. She was learning that the difference was everything. Julian was every bit as smooth as his reputation. He rose when she arrived, pulled out her chair, ordered wine she hadn't asked for, and spent the first 20 minutes being charming in the practiced, weightless way of a man who has never once said something true by accident. Grace let him. She was good at letting men talk. Men told you everything if you just let them talk. "You're wasting yourself over there," Julian said eventually, swirling his wine. "A woman with your mind working for a man like Calloway. You know what he is. I know what people say he is. They say it because it's true." Julian leaned in. "Grace. Can I call you Grace? I asked you here because I think you're an honest person trapped in a dishonest place. And I think you deserve to know the truth about your employer before it costs you something you can't get back." He reached into a leather case beside his chair and drew out a folder. 12 years ago, there was a fire at a warehouse called Pier 9. Men died. The official story is that it was an accident. It wasn't. He slid the folder across the table. Grace opened it. Inside was a ledger, or part of one. The pages singed at the edges, the paper brown with age and smoke. Handwritten columns of numbers, dates, dollar amounts. And down at the bottom of one page, a set of initials and a signature that appeared to tie the whole thing to Nathan's late father. And then on the next page, in a different hand, another notation that seemed to implicate Nathan himself. "That's his father's ledger," Julian said, watching face. "And that second page. He was young, but he was already part of it. They set that fire to collect the insurance and silence some employees who were about to talk. Your boss helped his father burn men alive for money, Grace. That's who's keeping you in his penthouse." Grace looked at the pages for a long time. And here's what Julian Vance did not know about Grace Bennett. He did not know that she had spent 10 years reading financial documents for a living. He did not know that she could tell the age of an ink by the way it sat on the fiber, that she knew what genuinely old paper smelled like and what artificially aged paper smelled like, that she could look at a ledger and know, the way a jeweler knows glass from diamond, whether it was real. This ledger was not real. The numbers were convincing. Somebody had done their homework. But the paper itself, under the smoke damage, under the careful browning, was too new. It had been manufactured years after the fire it claimed to record. Somebody had built this document deliberately, aged it deliberately, singed it deliberately, and handed it to Julian Vance to hand to her because somebody wanted Grace to believe that Nathan had murdered his own father. The evidence was bait, which meant Julian Vance was not the man behind the flowers. He was a tool, a well-dressed, expensive tool, being used by someone smarter than he was, and he had no idea. That was the real information Grace took away from that dinner, not the fake ledger, the fact that Julian thought it was real. "Thank you for showing me this," Grace said, closing the folder. She did not tell him it was fake. Let him think she'd swallowed it. Information was only valuable if the other side didn't know you had it. "I need to think." "Of course you do." Julian smiled, satisfied, certain he'd landed the blow. "Take your time, Grace, but not too much time. Men like Calloway have a way of making problems disappear when they get nervous." She left him there with his wine and his fake ledger and his certainty, and she walked out to the car where Nathan's man was waiting, and it was only when she was safely inside that she let herself feel how fast her heart was beating. Because she'd just sat across from a piece of a much larger machine, and for the first time she could feel the size of the thing they were up against. This wasn't one man with a grudge. This was somebody with resources, patience, and a plan that had been running for 18 months. And then she got back to the penthouse and discovered that while she'd been at dinner, the machine had made its next move. Nathan met her at the private elevator, and the look on his face stopped her before she'd taken 2 steps. He was holding a photograph, not on a phone. A printed photograph, glossy, professional. "This was delivered here," he said, "to my home, while you were at dinner." Grace took it, and her blood went cold. It was a photograph of her walking into the restaurant 2 hours earlier, caught from across the street, sharp and clear. Somebody had been watching. Somebody had photographed her, printed the image, and delivered it to Nathan's most private residence, the fortress, the place he'd sworn no one could reach, all in the time it had taken her to eat dinner and drink half a glass of wine she hadn't ordered. And across the bottom of the photograph, in the same silver ink as the black card, someone had written 7 words. "The next flowers will be for her funeral." Grace's hand was steady when she set the photo down. She was proud of that later, that her hand didn't shake. But inside, everything had gone very quiet and very cold, the way the world goes quiet right before something breaks. Nathan was not quiet. Nathan was standing in the middle of his own living room with murder in his eyes. And Grace could see, plain as day, exactly what he was about to do. He was going to make a phone call. He was going to send men out into the night. He was going to find Julian Vance and everyone connected to him, and he was going to turn the entire weight of the thing he'd inherited loose on them, right now, tonight, and God help anyone who got in the way. Nathan, she said, stop. They threatened your life. In my home. I know what they did. Then you know what happens now. He was already reaching for his phone. I should have ended this the night of the flowers. I let you talk me into being careful, and they walked right up to my front door. That ends tonight. No. Grace crossed the room and put her hand flat on his chest, and it stopped him, not because she was strong enough to stop him physically, but because he let it stop him, and that was the whole point. Listen to me. Listen. If you go out there tonight and burn everything down, you are doing exactly what they want. They want me to protect you. They want you to react. Grace kept her hand where it was, kept her voice level, kept her eyes on his. Think about it. Think about who we're dealing with. This isn't Julian. Julian's a puppet. The ledger he gave me tonight was a fake, a good fake, built by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. Somebody sent me flowers to make you angry. Somebody used a dead man's badge to make you afraid. And now somebody photographed me and delivered it to your home, the one place you thought was untouchable, to make you feel powerless. Every single move they've made has been designed to do one thing, Nathan. Push you, provoke you, get you to do something violent and public and stupid. She pressed harder. If you go out there tonight, you're not fighting them. You're obeying them. She watched it land. She watched the fury in him meet the logic in her words and grind against it. And she watched for the first time in his life, the logic win. Then what? Nathan said, and his voice was rough. What do I do? Because I cannot stand here and do nothing while somebody promises to bury you. You don't do nothing, Grace said. You do the last thing they'll expect from a man like you. She took her hand off his chest. You get smart. You stop reacting and you start thinking. They've been 3 steps ahead of us this whole time because they know exactly how you'll respond to everything. So we stop being predictable. We stop giving them the angry, violent, cornered animal they keep poking with a stick. She held his eyes, and we set a trap of our own. For a long moment, Nathan didn't move, and Grace understood the size of what she was asking. She was asking the most feared man in Chicago, a man whose entire power came from the certainty that he would always strike back harder than you hit him, to swallow that, to hold it, to let an enemy threaten the woman he loved and respond with patience instead of blood. She was asking him to trust her judgment over his own instincts, over a lifetime of instincts that had kept him alive. A trap, he said slowly. We control it. We choose the ground. We decide what they see and when they see it. Grace felt her own pulse steadying as she spoke, the way it always did when she moved from feeling into planning, because planning was where she lived. Whoever's doing this is inside the company. They have access. They have information. They've been watching us both. So we give them something to watch. We build a story only the traitor would care about. We feed it into the company and we see who moves. Nathan looked at her for a long, long moment. And then something happened that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. Because it was the moment she understood that this man had genuinely changed, or at least begun to. He put his phone back in his pocket. All right, he said, we do it your way. And Grace realized that for the first time since his father died, since maybe long before that, Nathan Calloway had let another person direct his response to being attacked. He'd handed the wheel to someone else, to her. And the fact that it terrified him, the fact that she could see it terrifying him and see him do it anyway, told her more about how he felt about her than any locked door or jealous question ever could. Okay, she said softly. Okay, then here's what we're going to do. They stayed up the whole night building it. Grace at the table with her laptop and her endless columns of numbers. Nathan across from her, the two of them working like they'd been working together for years instead of scheming for their lives. And as the sky started to gray toward morning, the plan took shape between them, clean and sharp and dangerous. Grace would construct a false trail. She would create records suggesting that she had discovered something the traitor could not afford to let live, a hidden master ledger, the real one. The actual accounting of everything that had been stolen and rerouted through Pier 9 over the last 18 months. The document that could send everyone involved to prison for the rest of their lives. She would make it look like she'd found it, and like it was hidden somewhere. Only she knew, and like she was getting ready to hand it to the authorities. And then she would leak it, but not to everyone. That was the elegant part, the part that was pure Grace. She would create 5 slightly different versions of the story, each one containing a unique detail, a specific false location, a particular fake account number, a distinct little lie. And she would feed each version to exactly one person, 5 senior people in the company, 5 people with the access and the knowledge to be the traitor. Whichever version reached Julian Vance would tell them, with mathematical certainty, which of the 5 had leaked it. The traitor would identify himself. He wouldn't be able to help it, because he'd have to act on what he learned. And the moment he acted, the specific lie he acted on would point straight back to the specific person Grace had told. "It's a fingerprint," Nathan said when she'd finished laying it out. He was looking at her with something that wasn't quite awe, but was close to it. "You're going to make them leave a fingerprint they can't see. That's the idea. And when we know who it is?" Grace closed her laptop. Outside, the first real light was coming up over the lake, and she was exhausted and afraid and more certain of anything than she'd been in years. "Then we'll know how deep this goes," she said. "And we'll know who inside your own house has been trying to kill us both." She didn't say the rest of it. She didn't say the thing that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the night of the flowers. The thing she almost didn't want to think, because thinking it made it real. Whoever this was, they weren't just inside the company. They were close to Nathan, close enough to reach his home, close enough to know how he'd react to everything, close enough that when the trap finally sprang and the truth finally came out, it was going to break something in him that Grace wasn't sure could be put back together. Because you don't build an operation like this against a man from the outside. You build it from beside him. The 5 names went into Grace's plan like 5 cards laid face down on a table, and she spent 2 days making sure each one got a version of the story that no one else would ever see. She was careful about it in the way only a person who lives inside numbers can be careful. The chief operations officer got a version that placed the fake master ledger in a records vault at the downtown office. The head of harbor security got a version that put it on an encrypted drive in Grace's own apartment. The senior's accounts manager got a version tied to a specific offshore account number that didn't exist. The company's outside counsel got a version involving a safe deposit box. And the 5th version, the last card, the one Grace almost didn't want to deal, went to Marcus Calloway, Nathan's cousin, Nathan's right hand, the man Nathan trusted more than anyone alive. Grace had hesitated over that one for a long time. She'd sat with the list in front of her and looked at Marcus's name and felt something in her stomach turn, because she knew what it would do to Nathan if it was him, and because she'd watched the 2 of them together for 3 years and seen nothing but loyalty. Marcus was the one who'd stood beside Nathan at his father's funeral. Marcus was the one who ran the parts of the business Nathan couldn't be bothered with, the one who never asked for credit, the one who'd bled for the family more than once. If you'd asked Grace a month ago to name the one person in Nathan's world who would never betray him, she'd have said Marcus without a second's thought, which was exactly why she put his name on the list. "He has to be on it," she told Nathan the night before they sprang the trap. "I know what you think of him, but a trap only works if you're willing to catch anyone. The second you start protecting people you're sure of, you've built a net with a hole in it. And the traitor knows you, Nathan. They know who you'd never suspect. So if I were them, if I were smart, I'd hide exactly there, in the last place you'd ever look." She watched him absorb that. She watched him hate it. But he didn't take Marcus off the list, and that told Grace that some part of Nathan, some cold, clear part underneath the loyalty, had already thought the same thing and buried it because he couldn't stand to look at it. "If it's him," Nathan said and stopped. "I know. You don't. You can't." He looked at her, and for a moment the empire fell away, and he was just a man who'd lost his mother and his father and had exactly one person left in the world he'd known his whole life. "He's the only family I have, Grace. My mother's gone. My father's gone. Marcus is it. If it's him, then I've got nobody." Then it was all a lie, all of it, every year of it. Grace didn't try to comfort him. She'd learned that Nathan didn't want comfort, that comfort felt like pity to him and pity felt like weakness. So she just said the true thing. "Then we'll find out together," she said. "And whatever it is, you won't be facing it alone. I'll be right here." The trap went live on a Tuesday morning at 9. Grace fed each version to each person through a channel that felt natural, a document left where it would be found, a comment made in confidence, a file shared with a note asking them to keep it quiet. She built it so that each of the 5 believed they'd stumbled onto something Grace hadn't meant for them to see. And then she sat back and she and Nathan waited, and the waiting was the worst part, because a trap is only a trap if something walks into it, and until something did, all they could do was watch. It took 31 hours. At 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, Julian Vance made a move. Grace's monitoring caught it the way she'd built it to: a flag on an account, a query run against a system, a search for a specific location. And the location Julian went looking for, the place he sent his people to find the master ledger, was a records vault at the downtown office, which was the version Grace had given to exactly one person. She stared at the screen for a long time before she could make herself say it out loud. Because she'd been braced for it, she'd told herself she was ready for any of the 5 names. And it turned out you were never ready. Not really. Not for this. Nathan, she said. He came and stood behind her and read it over her shoulder, and she felt him go completely still. The version Julian had acted on. The records vault downtown. That was the version she'd fed to the chief operations officer, a man named Harold Voss, who'd worked for the company for 20 years. Not Marcus. Grace felt the relief hit her so hard she almost laughed, and she felt Nathan let out a breath he'd probably been holding for 2 days. And for one bright, foolish second, both of them believed it was over. It was Voss. It had always been Voss. Marcus was clean. The world made sense again. Then Grace looked closer at the data, and the second the relief left her, it was replaced by something much worse. Because the search Julian had run wasn't clean. It wasn't a single query from a single source. When Grace pulled it apart, layer by layer, following the access the way she followed everything, back through systems, back through the permissions, back to the origin, she found that the information hadn't come from Voss at all. Voss's version had been used as a mask. Someone had taken Voss's version of the story and laundered it through Voss's credentials to make it look like Voss was the leak. But the actual access, the real fingerprint underneath the fake one, the hand that had actually reached into the system and pulled the string, belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who'd had access to all 5 versions. Someone who could see what Grace fed to each of the 5 and choose which one to use as camouflage. There was only one person in the entire company with that level of access. One person who sat close enough to Nathan to see everything, to touch everything, to know which version went to whom. One person who could frame Harold Voss because he was the only one who could see all the cards Grace had dealt. Grace turned around slowly in her chair and looked up at Nathan, and she didn't have to say it. She watched him read it in her face, watched understanding arrive, watched 20 years of trust and grief and family collapse in his eyes all at once. "It's Marcus," she said quietly. "It was always going to be Marcus. He framed Voss to buy himself cover. He's the only one who could have." For a moment, Nathan didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, and Grace watched the most feared man in Chicago receive the single worst piece of news of his life, and she watched him do the thing he always did with pain, which was to press it down so far and so hard that it disappeared behind his eyes and left only the cold. "My cousin," Nathan said. His voice had gone flat. Dead flat. "My mother's sister's son. He carried my father's casket." He turned away from her and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, and Grace let him have it, let him have the minute he needed. 18 months, he said finally. "He's been rebuilding the thing that killed my father for 18 months, right beside me, and I never saw it. I never saw it, Grace. You weren't supposed to. That was the point." "Why?" He turned around. And there was something raw in his face now, something that had broken through the cold. Why would he do this? He had everything. Anything he wanted, I'd have given it to him. He didn't have to steal it. He didn't have to burn anything down. Why? And Grace, who had spent the last 2 days pulling apart not just the numbers but the man behind them, gave him the answer she'd found. "Because you changed the company," she said, "and he couldn't forgive you for it." She'd found it in the pattern of the theft, in what got stolen and what didn't, in which parts of the old operation Marcus had rebuilt, and which he'd left alone. And once she saw the pattern, she understood the man. Marcus Calloway didn't want money. Marcus had plenty of money. What Marcus wanted was the old world back, the world Nathan had inherited, and then slowly over years started to dismantle. Because Nathan had been changing things. Grace had watched it happen without fully understanding what she was watching. Over the 3 years she'd worked for him, Nathan had been quietly moving the company toward the light, investing in legitimate business, cutting ties with the parts of the operation that dealt in blood and fear, building something that could survive in daylight. He'd never talked about why, but Grace understood now. A man who'd lost his mother to that world and his father to that world had spent his whole adult life trying to build something his own children, if he ever had any, wouldn't die for. And Marcus had watched him do it, and Marcus had seen betrayal. "He thinks you've gone soft," Grace said. "He thinks you've weakened the family." He thinks investing in legitimate business is surrender, and listening to me, an outsider, a woman, someone from outside the blood, is the final insult. In his mind, he's not betraying you, Nathan. In his mind, he's saving the family from you. He's taking back the empire before you can turn it into something he doesn't recognize. He wants to remove you, put Julian's resources behind him, and rebuild the whole thing the way your father ran it, through fear. Nathan absorbed this. The flowers, he said slowly. The flowers were never really about scaring me, Grace said, and this was the part that had made her cold when she'd finally understood it. Think about it. Every move he made was designed to provoke you. The roses, to make you jealous and reckless. The photograph at your home, to make you feel powerless and enraged. Julian's fake ledger, to make you look guilty. He was building a case, Nathan. He wanted you to react. He wanted you to hurt Julian in public, in front of witnesses, to give himself the evidence he needed to say you'd become unstable, dangerous, unfit to run the family. And then he'd step in as the reasonable one, the loyal cousin forced to remove you for everyone's good. The whole thing was theater, and you and I were supposed to play our parts. And instead you made me stop. Instead I made you stop. Grace held his eyes. That's why we're still standing, Nathan. Every time your instinct told you to strike, and you didn't, you took a weapon out of his hands. He's been playing a game that only works if you're predictable. And for the first time in your life, you weren't. Nathan was quiet for a long time, and then he did something Grace didn't expect. He crossed the room and stood in front of her and looked down at her, and there was something in his face she'd never seen before. Something that wasn't the boss, and wasn't the empire, and wasn't even the jealous man from the locked office 3 weeks ago. You saved my life, he said, 12 times. And I don't just mean the trap. He shook his head slowly. You saved the part of me that was still worth saving. If it had just been me, that night with the flowers, I'd have gone out and burned the whole city down looking for whoever sent them. And Marcus would have won, and I'd have become exactly what he needed me to be. You stopped that. You've been stopping it this whole time. Grace didn't know what to say, so she said the honest thing. I stopped it because you let me, she said. Don't give me the credit for your own choices, Nathan. You could have locked me out. You could have overruled me. Every single time. You chose not to. That was you, not me. Something passed between them then, in that quiet room, something that had been building since the night of the roses, and that neither of them was ready to name. And it might have gone somewhere, right then, if the phone hadn't rung. It was building security. And the moment Grace heard Nathan's side of the call, she knew the plan had just gone sideways. Say that again, Nathan said into the phone. His voice had changed. When? Where? A pause. Who was on that detail? A longer pause, and Grace watched his face turn to stone. Those are my men. Those are my own men. He hung up. Nathan, what is it? Grace. He was already moving, already reaching for his coat, and there was a fear in his eyes now that she'd never seen, worse than the night of the flowers. Where's your sister? Where's Emma? The floor dropped out of Grace's stomach. She's at school. She's at the university. Why, Nathan? Why are you asking about Emma? Call her. Right now. Call her and make sure she answers. Grace called. It rang and rang and rang, and Grace's heart climbed higher into her throat with each ring. And then, on the 6th ring, Emma answered, sleepy and confused and annoyed and completely blessedly fine, and Grace nearly sat down from the relief. She's okay, Grace said, muffling the phone against her shoulder. She's fine. She's in her dorm. She's okay. Nathan, what is going on? But she already knew. She knew before he said it. Because there was only one reason. Nathan would suddenly be terrified about Emma. Only one reason he'd be asking about her sister. And the reason was that if Marcus couldn't provoke Nathan through Grace anymore, if the direct threats hadn't worked, then Marcus would find the softer target. The one Grace loved most. The one who didn't know any of this was happening. He knows about Emma, Grace whispered. It wasn't a question. You told me you'd learn things about me. That I pay her tuition. That she thinks it's a scholarship. If you know that, then Marcus knows that. He's been watching me the whole time. He knows exactly what I care about. The call was a warning from my head of security, Nathan said grimly. One of the men on the detail I assigned to watch the harbor, one of my own men, went off the grid 2 hours ago. Didn't check in, didn't respond, and when we pulled his recent movements, he'd been running searches. On your family, on Emma's school, on your mother's address. Grace felt something go very cold and very clear inside her, the way it always did in the worst moments, the way it had the night of the photograph. The fear was there, but underneath the fear was the planner. And the planner was already 3 moves ahead. Then we move faster, she said. Marcus knows we're on to him, or he's about to. The trap sprang, Julian moved, and the second Marcus realizes his own leak got traced, he's going to panic, and panicked people do stupid, dangerous things. We can't wait for the slow version of this anymore, Nathan. We have to force it. We have to end it before he decides to hurt someone I love to get to me. How? Grace thought fast. We give him one more thing to want. One last piece of bait, but bigger. The real master ledger. Not a fake this time, the actual accounting. Everything I've built over the last 3 weeks. All the evidence against him and Julian both. We let him find out that it exists, that it's real, that it can put him in prison for the rest of his life, and that it's about to go to the authorities. He can't let that live. He'll have to come for it. And when he does, we'll be ready. And this time we'll have him committing to a crime we can prove, in a place we choose. You want to use yourself as bait. I want to use the ledger as bait. I'm just the person holding it. That's the same thing, Grace, and you know it. Nathan's jaw was tight. The last message said the next flowers would be for your funeral. And now he's got a man off the grids, searching for your family. You want to walk into that. I want to end it, Grace said. Because the alternative is spending the rest of my life waiting for flowers and waiting for someone to touch Emma. And I won't do it, Nathan. I won't live like that. I'd rather end it on ground I choose than get caught on ground he chooses. She held his eyes. You told me the night of the roses that you couldn't protect me by locking me in a room. This is the other side of that. You have to let me take the risk, because it's my life and my sister and my choice. She watched him war with it, the way he'd warred with everything since the night they'd met, the instinct to control against the promise he'd made to respect her freedom. And she watched him choose again, the harder thing. All right, he said, but we do it airtight. My people, my ground, every exit covered. They didn't get the chance. Because Marcus, it turned out, wasn't waiting for bait. Marcus had already made his move hours before, and the man off the grid wasn't hunting Emma at all. That had been the misdirection. The real play was somewhere else entirely, and Grace didn't understand it until the next afternoon when she went down to the parking garage beneath the office to get a file out of her car, alone for 90 seconds, because she'd told the driver she'd be right back. 90 seconds was all it took. She heard the footsteps behind her, and she turned, and she recognized the 2 men walking toward her because she'd seen them 100 times. They were Nathan's men, part of his own security detail. The men who were supposed to be protecting her, and Marcus Calloway was standing between them. Grace, Marcus said, and he smiled. And it was the same warm, easy smile she'd seen across 100 meetings, the loyal cousin, the trusted right hand, and that was the most frightening part. He could do this wearing that face. You've made an incredible mess of things. You really have. 3 weeks ago, Nathan was a man I understood. And then you sat down across from him and started whispering, and now I don't recognize him at all. He shook his head, almost sorrowful. I gave you every chance to just be a set of numbers, but you had to be clever. You had to actually see your own, Grace said, backing toward her car, her mind racing. How many of them are yours, Marcus? More than Nathan. That's the thing about loyalty, Grace. It goes to whoever's really in charge. And for a while now, in the ways that matter, that's been me. He nodded at the 2 men. Bring her. Gently. She's more useful with all her fingers. Grace ran. She got 2 steps before one of them caught her arm. And she fought. She genuinely fought. But there were 2 of them and they were twice her size. And in the end, there was nothing she could do but let them put her in the back of a car and think the whole time one clear, cold thought. He needs me alive. He needs something from me. That's the only reason I'm not already dead. They drove for 40 minutes. And Grace spent every second of it thinking, because thinking was the only weapon she had left. She figured out where they were going before they got there. It made a terrible kind of sense. Marcus would take her to the one place that meant everything. The place where the whole story had started. The place that officially didn't exist. Pier 9, the warehouse where Nathan's father had died. The heart of the operation Marcus had rebuilt. Of course that was where he'd take her. Men like Marcus loved symbols. He wanted to finish it where it began. They brought her into the warehouse, and Marcus was waiting, and he had a laptop set up on a table. And Grace understood immediately what he needed from her. The company's encrypted accounts, Marcus said, gesturing at the laptop. The real ones. The ones only you and Nathan can access. Nathan changed the protocols 6 months ago, locked me out, and I've been working around it ever since. But you can get in. So you're going to. You're going to open every account, transfer control to me, and then you're going to help me disappear the evidence you spent 3 weeks building. And in exchange, your sister at the university and your mother in her little house both get to keep living their nice, quiet lives. And here Grace made a decision. She could refuse. She could be brave and defiant and refuse. And Marcus would threaten Emma, and eventually she'd have to do it anyway, and she'd have lost the only thing she had left, which was the element of surprise. Or she could do exactly what he asked and use it against him. Okay, Grace said, okay. Just don't hurt them. I'll open the accounts. She sat down at the laptop. Her hands were steady. Marcus stood behind her, watching, and stood by the door, and Grace began to type. And what Marcus saw was a woman broken, complying, opening the encrypted accounts one by one exactly as he'd demanded. What Marcus did not see, because it was buried inside the same access, running silent underneath everything else, was that Grace was doing something else at the same time. She was activating an audit program, a dead man switch she'd built into the system weeks ago, the night after the flowers. When she'd first understood deep this went and had decided that if it ever came to this, she would not go in unarmed. The program did three things, all at once, all invisible. It froze every account connected to Marcus Calloway, so that the moment he tried to move a single dollar, the whole thing would lock like a bank vault. It began quietly recording everything, the accounts, the transfers, the access, building an ironclad case in real time. And it sent an alert, encrypted and automatic, with the warehouse's exact location attached, to two recipients. The first was Nathan. The second was a name Grace had been quietly holding in reserve since the very beginning, a federal agent whose card had crossed Grace's desk months ago in connection with an entirely different matter, an agent who had made it very clear she was interested in Calloway Freight and Harbor. Her name was Rebecca Sloan, and Grace, who never threw away a card, who never closed a door she might need later, had kept Agent Sloan's number. Now both of them knew exactly where Grace was. There, Grace said, sitting back. It's open. It's all open. You have what you wanted. Marcus leaned over her shoulder to look, and his smile widened, and he had no idea at all, that the woman he'd underestimated had just handed him a loaded gun and pointed it at his own head. Good, he said. Very good, Grace. See, you're smart. Smart people survive. And that was when Grace heard it, faint and far off, over the sound of the storm that had rolled in off the lake and was starting to hammer the roof of the warehouse that officially didn't exist. The sound of a car, coming fast. Marcus heard it too. His head came up. His smile faltered. And Grace, sitting very still at the laptop, with her hands enfolded in her lap and her heart pounding, allowed herself, for the first time in 40 minutes, the smallest possible breath of hope. You should have killed me in the garage, Marcus, she said quietly. You needed me alive, and I needed 90 seconds at a keyboard. I think I got the better end of that deal. His face changed. And outside in the storm, the car doors slammed. The doors of the warehouse burst open, and Nathan Calloway came through them, like the storm itself. And for 1 second, everything stopped. Marcus straightened up from behind Grace's chair. The two men by the door turned. And Nathan stood in the entrance with rain running off him, and his eyes going straight to Grace, checking her, counting her fingers, making sure she was whole before they moved to the man standing behind her. Marcus, Nathan said. And Grace heard in that single word 20 years of everything. Cousin, Marcus said. And he put his hand on Grace's shoulder. Not hard, just enough. Just enough to remind everyone in the room exactly where she was sitting and exactly how close his hand was to her. You made good time. I wasn't expecting you for another 20 minutes. But then, I keep forgetting. You've got a new set of priorities these days, don't you? Nathan didn't move. Grace watched him take in the room the way he took in everything. Fast and total. The two men, the exits, the distance, the hand on her shoulder. She watched him calculate, and she watched him understand that there was no version of this where he could move fast enough to reach her before Marcus did something they'd all regret. Let her go, Nathan said. This is between us. It always was. She's not part of the family. She's not part of the blood. She's not part of any of it. Let her walk out, and you and I finish this the way it should have been finished a long time ago. See, that's the problem. Marcus's hand stayed where it was. She is part of it now. You made her part of it the second you started listening to her instead of me. 3 weeks, Nathan. 3 weeks ago, you were a man I could work with. A man who understood what this family is, what it costs, what it takes. And then she sat down across a desk from you and started whispering about consequences and choices and the man you want to become, and you turned into someone I don't know. He shook his head slowly. I've known you since we were 6 years old. I carried your father's casket. And I'm standing here looking at you, and I swear to God, I don't recognize you anymore. Because I stopped being my father. Nathan's voice was quiet and hard. That's what you can't forgive, isn't it? That I looked at what he built, and what it did to this family, and I decided I didn't want it. My mother's gone because of what he built. He's dead because of what he built. And you want me to keep building it. I want you to be who you were supposed to be." For the first time, something raw came into Marcus's voice, something underneath the calm. "You had everything handed to you. Everything. The name, the empire, the throne, all of it just because you were born to the right brother. And you're throwing it away. You're turning it into a shipping company, Nathan. A legitimate, boring, powerless shipping company. You're taking the one thing that made us untouchable and you're setting it on fire, and you expect me to just stand here and watch. So you'd kill me for it. I'd save the family from you." Marcus said it simply, and that was the horror of it, that he believed it. "You're not a traitor because you're weak, cousin. You're a traitor because you're soft. And soft is worse. Soft gets everyone killed." Grace, sitting between them with a hand on her shoulder and a frozen empire's worth of accounts, humming silently on the laptop in front of her, chose that moment to speak. Because she'd been watching Marcus, and she'd seen something, and she knew that the only weapon she had left was the truth. "Your father died here too," she said. The hand on her shoulder tightened. "I read the files, Marcus," Grace went on, keeping her voice level, keeping her eyes forward. "The real ones. Not the fake ledger you had Julian hand me. The real records of what happened at Pier 9 12 years ago. And your father's name is in them. He didn't die somewhere else. He died right here, in this warehouse, in the same fire that killed Nathan's father. Didn't he?" Behind her, Marcus went very still. "That's what this is really about," Grace said. And now she understood it fully. Now the whole terrible shape of it came clear. It was never about the company being too soft. It was never about the money. This is about the fire. Both of your fathers died here, and one of them ordered it. "Grace," Nathan said, "what are you talking about?" And Grace, who had put the last piece together only that morning, sitting in the encrypted files at 3 a.m. when she couldn't sleep, told him the thing she'd been dreading, having to say. "Your father set the fire, Nathan." The words landed in the warehouse and nobody moved. "There were employees getting ready to testify," Grace said gently, because there was no gentle way to say it, but she tried. 12 of them. They'd been talking to investigators about the operation, the smuggling, the routes, all of it, and your father found out. And he decided the cheapest way to make the problem go away was to make sure those employees never made it to a courtroom. She swallowed. "So he ordered this warehouse burned, with them inside it, 12 years ago. And your father was here that night, and something went wrong, and he died in the fire he set. That's the part the company covered up. That's why Pier 9 got scrubbed off the books. Not to hide that men died, to hide that your father murdered them." Nathan's face had gone white, and Marcus's father, Grace said quietly, was one of the men in this building that night. He wasn't supposed to be. He came to try to stop it, or he came because your father summoned him. I couldn't tell which. But he died here too. Marcus's father died in your father's fire. She turned her head, just enough to look up at the man standing behind her. "That's what you've been carrying for 12 years. Isn't it, Marcus? Your father died in this warehouse because Nathan's father lit the match. And nobody ever told you the truth. They told you it was an accident. They let you grieve a lie. The silence in the warehouse was absolute. And when Marcus spoke, his voice had changed completely. All the smooth control was gone. What was left underneath was a boy who'd lost his father and been handed a lie to bury him with. I found out 4 years ago," Marcus said. "I found the files, same as you. I found out that my father died in this building because his brother-in-law decided 12 men were cheaper to burn than to pay off. And I found out that everyone knew. My whole life, everyone knew. And they all looked me in the eye at every family dinner and let me believe it was an accident." His hand was shaking now against Grace's shoulder. "And you want to know the worst part, Nathan? Your father didn't even come to the funeral. His own brother-in-law. He sent flowers. He sent flowers to the funeral of a man he burned alive. And there it was." Grace understood in that moment the whole architecture of the horror. The flowers. The roses. 12 years of grief that had curdled into a plan, and the plan had begun at the very beginning, with a bouquet sent to her desk with a dead man's name on the card. Marcus hadn't chosen flowers by accident. He'd chosen them because his father's murderer had sent flowers to the grave. And Marcus had spent 12 years turning that obscene gesture over in his hands until he could hand it back. "That's why you sent me roses," Grace said softly. "Not just to provoke Nathan. It was the same message his father sent your father's funeral. You were finishing something." "I was giving it back," Marcus said. "All of it. Every flower his family ever sent to a grave they dug." "Marcus." Nathan took a step forward, and his voice had broken open. the cold gone out of it entirely. And what was left was grief, raw and unguarded. The grief of a man learning in one sentence that his father was a murderer and his cousin was a victim, and everything he'd believed about his own family was rotten to the root. I didn't know. I swear to you on my mother, Marcus. I did not know. They told me it was an accident too. They told me my father died a victim. I've spent 12 years hating whoever set that fire, and it was him. It was my own father. Would it have mattered? Marcus's voice cracked. If you'd known? Yes, Nathan said. God help me. Yes, it would have mattered. Because you're my family, Marcus. You're the only family I have left. And your father was mine too. He taught me to fish. He came to my mother's memorial when my own father wouldn't say her name. I loved him. And I never knew he died in this room. And I never knew it was us, our family, that killed him. If I'd known, I'd have burned this whole empire down myself. I'd have handed it to you. I'd have done anything. For a moment, one moment, Grace felt the hand on her shoulder loosen. She felt Marcus waver. She felt the possibility, small and fragile, that the truth might do what force never could, that two men who'd both been lied to their whole lives might find, in the wreckage, some way back to each other. And then Julian Vance's voice came from the shadows by the office at the back of the warehouse. Well, Julian said, stepping into view with a gun in his hand and a stack of files under his arm. This is touching. Really. But we're running short on time, Marcus, and your family reunion is going to get us both arrested. So if the numbers woman has opened the accounts, let's take what we came for and go. And Grace understood, with a cold drop in her stomach, that Julian had been there the whole time listening, and that Julian did not care about anyone's dead father. Julian cared about money. Julian had latched onto Marcus's grief, and Marcus's planned the way a parasite latches onto a wound, and used it, and steered it, and turned a grieving man's revenge into a simple, ugly heist. Julian, Marcus said, and there was exhaustion in it. Put it away. It's over. She's frozen the accounts, hasn't she? He looked down at Grace. That's what you did. When you were typing, you didn't open them for me. You locked them, I locked them, Grace confirmed. The second you try to move a dollar, the whole thing seizes. And it's already recording. Everything said in this room, everything done, it's building a case as we speak. And it's already sent our location to two people. One of them just walked through that door. She nodded at Nathan. The other one is about to. Julian's face changed. You're bluffing. I don't bluff, Mr. Vance. I do, Matt. Grace kept her voice steady even with a gun in the room now. You checked a records vault yesterday, looking for a master ledger. That was bait. I fed it to you specifically to see who you'd tell. You told Marcus, which is how we knew it was him. Everything you've done for 2 weeks, you've done because I let you see something I wanted you to see. You've been my puppet since the night of that fake ledger. You just didn't know it. Julian raised the gun. Then I'll solve the problem the simple way. Julian Marcus started, and a lot of things happened very fast. Grace, who had been sitting with her hands folded and her feet planted for exactly this moment, drove her heel down onto the pedal she'd found under the table 30 minutes ago, the manual trigger for the warehouse's old fire suppression system. The one thing in this dead building that Marcus's people hadn't disconnected, because they'd never imagined anyone would want it. The system screamed to life. Water crashed down from the ceiling in a roaring wall, alarms shrieked, and for 3 seconds no one in that warehouse could see anything at all. 3 seconds was all Nathan needed. He crossed the room through the deluge and reached Grace and got his body between her and Julian's gun, and he had her out of the chair and moving before Julian could clear his eyes. And in the same 3 seconds, the doors of the warehouse came apart. A second time, and this time it wasn't one man in a storm. This time it was a dozen federal agents in tactical gear pouring through every entrance at once, weapons up, voices shouting, and at the front of them, soaked and furious and absolutely in command, was Agent Rebecca Sloan. Federal agents, everybody down. Hands where I can see them now. The 2 men who'd taken Grace in the garage went down without a fight. They were muscle, and muscle knows when the game is over. Julian did not go down. Julian, who had spent his whole life believing he could talk or buy his way out of anything, turned and ran for the back of the warehouse with his files under his arm, toward a loading door and the storm beyond it, and he almost made it. Agent Sloan was waiting at the loading door. Mr. Vance, she said, and Grace heard it even over the alarms and the water. I've been trying to get a case against you for 3 years, and you just committed 6 felonies on a recording. Put the files down. Julian put the files down, and that left Marcus. The water was still coming down. The agents had the room. And Marcus Calloway stood in the middle of it all. In the warehouse where his father had died, soaked to the skin, and he had a gun of his own now, drawn sometime in the chaos, and he was not pointing it at the agents. He was pointing it at Nathan. Marcus. Nathan pushed Grace behind him and stepped forward, into the line of the gun, and the agent's weapons all came up at once, and Agent Sloan was shouting, and Nathan lifted one hand and said, "Hold, hold, everybody hold." And somehow, because it was Nathan, they held. "Marcus, look at me, it's over," Julian's finished. "The accounts are frozen. The evidence has already gone to the federals. There's no empire left to take. There's nothing left to fight for. It's just you and me, cousin. Just us. The way it was when we were kids." I could still finish it. Marcus's hand was shaking. Water ran down his face, and Grace couldn't tell anymore what was rain and what wasn't. "I could still do the one thing I came here to do. 12 years, Nathan. 12 years I've carried this. Your father killed mine and sent flowers to the grave. And every single person I loved looked me in the eye and lied about it. And you want me to just put the gun down and forgive?" "No," Nathan said. "I don't want you to forgive. I don't think you should forgive. What was done to your father? What was done to you? There's no forgiving it. I'm not asking for that." He took another step forward into the gun until the barrel was almost against his chest. "I'm asking you not to let my father do it again. Because that's what this is, Marcus. If you pull that trigger, you don't get your father back. You don't get justice. You just let a dead man reach out of that fire 12 years later and take one more thing from you, your soul. He already took your father. Don't let him take you too." The gun trembled. And Grace, behind Nathan, watching a man decide whether to become a murderer, did the only thing she could think to do. She spoke, and she spoke the truth, because the truth was the only weapon that had ever worked in this whole terrible story. "Marcus." Her voice cut through the alarms. "Your father came here that night to stop the fire. That's in the files too. He didn't come to help. He came because he found out what your uncle was planning, and he came to stop it. He died trying to save those men. She let that land. That's who your father was. He ran toward a burning building to save people he barely knew. Don't dishonor that by turning into the man who lit it. Be your father's son, not your uncle's." For a long, long moment, Marcus Calloway stood in the water with a gun against his cousin's chest and 12 years of grief in his eyes, and the whole world waited. And then he lowered the gun. He didn't drop it. He lowered it slowly and turned it in his hand and held it out, grip first to the nearest agent, and he sank down to his knees in the water on the floor of the warehouse where his father had died, and he wept. Nathan went down with him. Right there in front of the federal agents, in front of everyone, the most feared man in Chicago knelt in the water and put his arms around his cousin and held him while he shook, and Grace stood over the two of them with tears running down her own face and understood that she was watching something break and something else maybe begin to heal. Agent Sloan let them have their minute. Then she nodded, and her people moved in, and they arrested Marcus Calloway gently, without force. And they took Julian Vance not gently at all. And they secured the warehouse and the laptop and the frozen accounts and 12 years of buried truth. All of it, at last, dragged out into the light. It was over. The part with the guns, anyway. The part that comes after is always longer. They kept Grace at the field office until nearly dawn. Statement after statement, question after question. And Grace answered all of it, truthfully, because she had nothing to hide, and because the truth was the only ground she trusted to stand on. And somewhere in the gray hours before morning, Agent Rebecca Sloan came into the room, where Grace was sitting with a cup of terrible coffee, and closed the door, and sat down across from her, and made her an offer. "You did something remarkable tonight," Sloan said. "That audit program, the recording, the frozen accounts. You handed me a case I've been trying to build for 3 years, and you did it from inside a kidnapping. I've been doing this a long time, Ms. Bennett, and I don't say this often. You're one of the sharpest people I've ever come across." "Thank you," Grace said carefully, because she'd learned to hear the shape of a thing before it arrived, "which is why I want to make you an offer." Sloan folded her hands. "Full immunity, complete protection, a clean slate and a new start anywhere you want. In exchange for everything you know about Nathan Calloway. Not Marcus, not Julian. I've already got them, Nathan. The whole operation, the years before you arrived, every account, every route, everything you've seen inside that company." She leaned forward. "You're an honest person who got pulled into a dishonest world. I can pull you back out, but I need you to help me put Nathan Calloway away to do it." And there it was. Grace sat with the terrible coffee going cold in her hands and understood that this was the real test, the one the whole night had been leading to, harder than the garage, harder than the warehouse, harder than the gun. Because Sloan wasn't wrong. Nathan was not innocent. Whatever he'd become over the last 3 years, whatever he'd started to build, he had inherited an empire soaked in blood, and he had run it. And there were records. And Grace had seen them. And if she opened her mouth, she could hand the government the man who'd knelt in the water and saved his cousin's soul. Let me ask you something, Grace said. Julian Vance, Marcus, the smuggling, the theft, the 12-year cover-up of a mass murder. You have all of that now. We do. And it's not enough. You want Nathan too. Sloan didn't blink. I want everything I can get, Ms. Bennett. That's the job. No, Grace said slowly. It's more than the job. You've been after Calloway Freight for 3 years. You said so yourself. And now you've got the whole thing wrapped up with a bow. Everyone who set that fire, everyone who profited from it, everyone who lied about it. And you're sitting here at 5 in the morning trying to talk me into giving you the one man who spent the last 3 years trying to drag that company into the daylight. She set the coffee down. This isn't justice anymore, Agent Sloan. This is a scalp. You want Nathan Calloway on your wall, and you want to use me to put him there. For the first time, something flickered in Sloan's composure. I'm not going to lie for him, Grace went on. Understand that. If you ask me to lie, to say he's innocent, to cover for things he did, I'd refuse. He did things. There are records. His own legitimate records will show plenty, and I won't hide a single line of them. He can answer for what he actually did. But I am not going to become a weapon in your personal campaign against a man for the crime of trying to become better than his father. I'll give you the truth. All of it. I won't give you a lie dressed up as one in either direction. She met the agent's eyes. You get Julian. You get Marcus. You get the whole conspiracy and the whole cover-up. And you get Nathan's real records, the ones that show what he actually did. And he faces exactly what those records say he should face. Not more. Not less. That's the deal. That's the only deal I've got. Rebecca Sloan looked at her for a long time. You know, she said finally, loving him doesn't make his crimes disappear. I know that better than anyone, Grace said. That's exactly why I won't lie about them. And it's exactly why I won't lie to bury him either. Because if I do either one, I'm no better than the people who lied to Marcus for 12 years. She stood up. The truth, Agent Sloan. That's what I'm offering. It's more than you'll get from anyone else in the whole mess. I'd take it if I were you. Sloan took it. It was not a clean ending because clean endings are a lie and Grace was done with lies. Over the weeks that followed, the truth did what Grace had promised it would do. It cut in every direction. The evidence buried Julian Vance under a mountain of felonies. It sent Marcus to face his own reckoning. Though Grace testified about his father, about the fire, about the 12 years of grief, not to excuse what he'd done, but because it was true. And the truth was owed even to a man who'd nearly killed her. And it turned on Nathan too, exactly as Grace had said it would. His own records, laid open, the real ones, the legitimate ones, showing exactly what he'd done and hadn't done in the years he'd run the empire he inherited. And Nathan, when it came, did not fight it. Grace had expected him to. She'd braced for the version of him that would lawyer up and bury the truth and use every resource he had to make it all disappear. Because that was who he'd been raised to be. Instead, when the evidence came out, when his own financial records became the thing that would cost him, Nathan came to Grace with something she hadn't seen coming. He felt betrayed. You gave them my records, he said. It was quiet and it hurt, and Grace made herself hold still and take it. I let you into everything. I trusted you with all of it. And you handed the federal government the rope to hang me with. I gave them the truth, Grace said. The same truth I'd have given them about anyone. I didn't lie for you, Nathan. And I didn't lie against you. I did the one thing I've done this entire time, which is refuse to lie at all. I could go to prison, Grace. You could, for the things you actually did, not for things you didn't. She stepped closer to him. You want to know the difference between me and everyone who ever betrayed you? Everyone who lied to Marcus for 12 years thought they were protecting him. They thought loyalty meant keeping the truth away from him, and it destroyed him. It turned his grief into a bomb. I will not do that to you. I will not love you by lying to you. That's not loyalty, Nathan. That's the same disease that killed your family. So what is loyalty then? His voice was raw. It's not standing by me. And Grace gave him the sentence that she would come back to for the rest of her life. The thing she'd finally understood in a warehouse full of water and grief. I will stand beside the man you choose to become, she said. I will not protect the monster you refuse to leave behind. Those are two different things, Nathan, and I'm only offering you one of them. He stared at her for a long moment, and then something in him let go, some last piece of the man his father had raised, and Grace watched him choose one final time, the harder thing. He dissolved it. All of it. Over the weeks that followed, Nathan Calloway took the empire he'd inherited and he took it apart with his own hands. He sold the offshore assets. He shut down the operations that couldn't survive the daylight. He turned over records, cooperated through his attorneys, and accepted what came. The penalties, the monitoring, the years of oversight, the loss of most of what his father had built. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood in the light. Grace had refused to let him escape, and he answered for what was true. And when it was done, when the dust had settled and the empire was gone, and what remained was a legitimate shipping company and a man who'd lost almost everything and kept the one thing that mattered, Grace did the thing that surprised him most of all. She left. She resigned. She packed up her corner office, the same office where a courier had once wheeled in 4 dozen roses, and she told Nathan she was going. "You're leaving," he said. He didn't try to stop her. He'd learned at last not to try to stop her. But she could see what it cost him. "After all of it, you're leaving." "I have to," Grace said gently. "And I need you to hear why, because it's not what you think. I'm not leaving because of what you did or what you were. I'm leaving because of what I can't be while I'm here." She looked around the office. "I've been financially dependent on you for 3 years. My salary, my sister's tuition, my mother's house, all of it flows through you. And I can't build anything real with you while that's true. I can't be your equal while I'm your employee. Every yes I've ever said to you has had your money underneath it, and I will never know, and neither will you, whether I stayed because I chose to or because I couldn't afford to leave." She held his eyes. "You asked me once who bought me those flowers. I need to become a woman who buys her own." Nathan was quiet for a long time. "Is there any hope?" he asked finally. "Just that. No demand, no argument, no locked door. For us. After. Is there any hope at all?" And Grace, standing in the doorway of the office where the whole story had started, gave him the answer that was the truest thing she knew. "Leave the door open," she said. "If I come back, it'll be because I chose to. And that's the only way I'd ever want to come back." She walked out. And Nathan Calloway, who had once turned a lock with 2 fingers to keep her in a room, stood in his empty office and did the hardest thing he had ever done in his life. He let her go. And he left the door open behind her. The first 6 months without Nathan Calloway were the hardest and the best of Grace Bennett's life. And she would have told you, if you'd asked, that both of those things were true at exactly the same time. She started with nothing but her name, and the thing she'd spent 3 years, proving she could do better than almost anyone alive, which was see the truth hidden inside a company's numbers. She rented a small office on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades, put 1 desk in it, and 1 chair and a hand computer, and she hung a sign on the door that said Bennett Risk, and she went to work for herself for the first time in her life. No salary from a man who loved her. No safety net woven from someone else's money. Just Grace and her mind, and the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of standing entirely on her own 2 feet. There were nights she couldn't sleep for the fear of it. She'd walked away from a fortune. She'd walked away from a man she loved. She was paying her sister's tuition out of an income she had to build from 1 client at a time. And there were weeks that first stretch where the math didn't work. And she lay awake doing it over and over in the dark. And every part of her that had ever been afraid whispered that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she could have had safety, that she could have had him, and she'd thrown it all away for the abstract dignity of independence. But every morning she got up anyway. And every morning she opened the door of Bennett Risk and sat down at her 1 desk and did the work. And slowly, the way a thing you build with your own hands is always slow and always real, it started to hold. Her first major contract found her, in the end, through the very wreckage she'd helped create. A group of dock workers, retired men and widows, people who'd given 30 and 40 years to the harbor, came to her because they'd lost their pensions. It turned out that one of Julian Vance's shell companies had spent years quietly draining the pension fund of a shipping subsidiary, dollar by dollar, until the men who'd earned that money discovered, on the eve of their retirements, that it was gone. They'd been to lawyers who told them it was hopeless. They'd been to the authorities who told them to get in line. And then someone told them there was a woman who could read a company's books, like a confession, and had a particular history with Julian Vance. And they came to Grace's little 3rd floor office with their hats in their hands and asked if she could help them find their stolen years. Grace took the case for almost nothing. And then she did what she did. It took her 4 months. 4 months of following the money, the way she followed everything, back through the shells and the fronts and the offshore accounts, tracing every stolen dollar to where it had gone, and more importantly, to where the recoverable assets still sat, frozen in the wreckage of Julian Vance's collapsed empire. She built the case the way she'd built the trap that caught Marcus, precise and patient and airtight, and she handed it to the right people with every number in its place. And one morning she got to make a phone call she would remember for the rest of her life. The pensions were coming back. Not all of it, but most of it. Enough. She thought that would be the end of it. The recovery, the restitution, a good deed done for people who deserved it. She did not expect what came next, because she'd stopped deliberately keeping track of what Nathan Calloway was doing. The public restitution meeting was held in a union hall, and Grace was there because the dock workers had asked her to be, to stand up in front of the men and women whose money she'd recovered and explain how it had happened. She was in the middle of doing exactly that when the door at the back of the hall opened and Nathan Calloway walked in. Alone, no bodyguards, no entourage, no special treatment, no reserved seat, no aura of the empire around him, because there was no empire anymore. He came in like anyone else, quietly, and took a seat in the back, and Grace lost her place in her own sentence for the first time in her professional life. She had not seen him in 6 months. He looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. But there was something else in him, something she'd never seen in all the time she'd known him, and it took her a moment to understand what it was, and when she did, it stole her breath. It was peace. Not happiness exactly, but the particular stillness of a man who has stopped fighting himself. Grace finished her presentation. She didn't know how. And when the formal part of the meeting ended, Nathan stood up and asked the room if he could say something, and the dock workers, who knew exactly who he was and exactly what his family had done to them, went silent and let him speak. "My name is Nathan Calloway," he said, "and most of you know my family's name better than you'd like to. For a lot of years, this company, my company, treated the people who did the actual work like they were numbers on a page. My father did, and for too long I did too. He stood there in front of a room full of people who had every reason to hate him. The money that was stolen from you was stolen by men I worked with. Some of it was stolen by men in my own family. And whether or not I knew the details, I was the one at the top, and it happened under my name, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend that a stranger did this to you. My family did this to you, I'm sorry. It's not enough. I know it's not enough. But it's true, and you've had enough lies from people like me to last a lifetime." The room was utterly silent. "So I'm not just going to apologize," Nathan went on. "Bennett recovered your pensions, and that's because of her, not me, and I want that understood. But I'm doing one more thing." He took a breath. "The remaining ownership shares of the harbor operations, the legitimate ones, the ones I still hold, I'm transferring into an employee trust, effective immediately. It means the people who do the work will own a piece of the thing they built. It means what happened to you can't happen again the same way, because you'll be the owners. And owners don't let people steal from themselves." He looked around the room. "It's not forgiveness. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying, for once in my life, to do the right thing when nobody's making me." And Grace, standing off to the side of that union hall, understood something that changed everything. He didn't know she'd be there. He'd come to that meeting not knowing Grace would see it. He'd made that apology, given away those shares, humbled himself in front of a room full of people who despised his name, and he'd done it all believing Grace Bennett was nowhere near. He hadn't done it to win her back. He hadn't done it for her to see. He'd done it because it was right, in a room where the only person who might have been watching was the version of himself he was finally trying to become. That was the moment Grace knew he'd actually changed. Not because he'd said the words. Anyone can say words. But because he'd done the hard, humble, costly thing when he thought no one who mattered to him was looking. He'd become good in the dark. And a man who becomes good in the dark has become good for real. They didn't speak at the meeting. There were too many people, and it wasn't the place. And Grace needed time to understand what she'd just watched. She slipped out before he could find her in the crowd, and she went home to her small apartment that she paid for with her own money. And she sat up most of the night with her whole life rearranging itself around what she'd seen. The next morning, a bouquet arrived at the offices of Bennett Risk. Grace's assistant, a young woman she'd been able to hire only 3 weeks earlier, brought it in and set it on the desk. And for one cold second, Grace was back in a glass-walled office on the 34th floor with 4 dozen funeral roses and a black card, and her whole body went tense. But it wasn't roses. It was a small, simple arrangement of white wildflowers. The kind that grow in fields and along roads, the kind nobody sends to make a statement, the kind that just look like something alive and honest and free. There was no towering extravagance to it, no possession in it, no black card, just a small white card. And on it, in Nathan's handwriting, 5 lines. No locks, no demands. Dinner if you choose Nathan. Grace looked at those wildflowers for a long time, and she understood the whole language of them because she'd learned to read this man the way she read everything. The roses 12 years ago had been a message from a murderer to a grave. The roses on her desk had been a threat dressed as a gift. Every extravagant, possessive, overwhelming bouquet in this whole story had been about power, about ownership, about one person reaching out to claim another. And here at the end of it, Nathan Calloway had sent her a handful of wildflowers that didn't claim anything at all. Flowers you couldn't own. Flowers that just were what they were. He'd finally understood the difference, and he'd said it in the only language they'd ever fully shared. No locks, no demands. She went to him that evening. She didn't tell him she was coming. She drove to the building that had once been the headquarters of an empire and was now just the offices of a legitimate shipping company. And she rode the elevator up to the top floor, and she walked to the office where the whole story had started, the office where a man had once locked a door with 2 fingers and demanded to know who had sent her flowers. Nathan was there, alone, sitting at the desk in the late light, and when Grace appeared in the doorway, he stood up so fast, he knocked a folder to the floor and didn't even notice. "Grace," he said, and then he did something she would never forget as long as she lived. Before she said a single word, before either of them said anything at all, Nathan Calloway stepped away from the door. He moved deliberately to the far side of the room, leaving the doorway completely clear, leaving her exit wide open, leaving her every possible way out. He'd once turned a lock to keep her in. Now, without her asking, without a word, he put as much space between himself and that door as the room allowed, so that she would know, in her body before her mind could even catch up, that she was free, that she could walk out any second, that whatever happened in this room, it would happen because she chose it. Grace felt her throat close. She walked to his desk, and she set the small bouquet of white wildflowers down on it, right in the middle, where 4 dozen roses had once sat. "Do you still want to know who bought me these flowers?" she asked. It was the question from the very beginning, the question that had started everything. And she watched him recognize it, watched him remember the storm and the roses and the locked door and the jealous, frightened man he'd been 6 months and a lifetime ago. Nathan looked at her, and he did not move toward the door. He did not reach for a lock. He just stood on the far side of the room where he'd put himself, and he answered her. "Only if you want to tell me," he said. And that was it. That was the whole thing right there. That was everything he'd learned in 6 months of losing an empire and finding a soul, compressed into 6 words. The old Nathan would have demanded. The old Nathan would have needed to know, would have burned the world down until he had an answer. This Nathan, the one who'd become good in the dark, the one who'd given away his fortune to people who hated him, the one who'd stepped away from the door, only wanted to know if she wanted him to know. Grace felt something in her chest that she'd been holding for 6 months finally let go. "I bought them," she said. "I bought them myself, Nathan, with my own money from my own company, after I recovered a group of old dock workers' stolen pensions and put food back on their tables. That's who bought me these flowers. I did. Nobody sent them. Nobody's making a statement with them. Nobody owns them, and nobody owns me." Her voice was steady and full at the same time. "They're mine. This whole life is mine now. I built it with my own 2 hands, and I answer to no one, and I depend on no one. And I stayed away for 6 months to make absolutely sure that whatever I did next, I did it as a free woman and not a kept one." And Nathan said quietly, he hadn't moved, "What do you want to do next?" Grace looked at him across the room, across the desk, across 6 months, and a warehouse full of water and a locked door that had started it all. "I want to begin again," she said, "not as your employee, not as the woman you're protecting, not as a possession you lock in a room to keep safe, as your equal. As a woman who could walk out that open door right now and build a perfectly good life without you, and who is choosing, freely, with nothing forcing her hand, to stay instead. That's the only way I'd ever have you, Nathan. And it's the only way worth having." Nathan crossed the room then, slowly, and he stopped in front of her, and he did not grab her, did not seize her, did not do any of the things the man from the locked office would have done. He just stood in front of her, close, and looked at her like she was the only honest thing left in his whole world, which, in a way, she had always been. "I spent my whole life," he said, "believing that the only way to keep something was to hold it so tight it couldn't get away. My father taught me that, and it cost him everything. It cost me everything. And then a woman I couldn't stop looking at stood in a locked office and told me I didn't own the people inside my own building. And it took me 6 months and an entire empire to understand that she was right. He shook his head slowly. You were always right, Grace. Love isn't a locked door. It's an open one. It's someone standing in a doorway they're free to walk through and choosing you anyway. I didn't understand that until I lost you. And I would rather have you free and choosing me than have anyone else in the world in chains. Grace took his hand, and their story did not erase what came before it. That was the thing they both understood, standing there in the light. Nathan's past didn't vanish because he'd become a better man. The men his family had hurt were still hurt. The years Marcus had lost to a lie were still lost. The father who'd set the fire was still a murderer, and the empire soaked in blood had still, for generations, been soaked in blood. None of that disappeared. But it became, instead of a thing they buried, the exact reason both of them had learned what they now knew. Grace had learned that independence didn't have to mean loneliness, that you could stand entirely on your own 2 feet and still choose to hold someone's hand, that freedom and love were not enemies but partners. And Nathan had learned the thing his father died without ever understanding, that to protect someone truly is to respect their freedom completely, that the tightest grip loses everything and the open hand keeps what matters. 1 year later, they stood together at Pier 9, the warehouse that officially didn't exist, the place where 2 fathers had died, the place where Grace had once been kidnapped, and where the whole terrible truth had finally come out in a storm of water and grief, had been rebuilt, not torn down. Nathan had wanted to tear it down at first to erase it, and Grace had told him no, that you don't heal a wound by pretending it was never there. So instead, they'd transformed it. It was a training center now, a real one, a place where young dock workers and logistics apprentices came to learn a trade and earn a fair wage and build honest lives. The building where men had been burned to bury the truth had become a building where the next generation learned to work in the light. Marcus's father had run toward that fire to save people. Now the place he'd died trying to protect saved people every single day. And Nathan turned to Grace on the floor of that transformed warehouse, and he asked her to become his partner in the foundation that ran it. He didn't ask her to marry him, not yet. That would come later, in its own time, in its own way. What he asked her first was to be his partner, his equal in the work. And he did the thing that told Grace, more than any ring ever could have, that he had truly become the man she'd waited 6 months to believe in. He handed her a contract, not a demand, not a locked door. A contract laid out in plain terms, an offer between equals that she was free to accept or refuse or negotiate exactly as she saw fit. The man who had once turned a lock with 2 fingers to keep her in a room now offered her a piece of paper she could tear up and walk away from without a word. Grace read it, all of it, carefully, the way she read everything. And then she signed it. But only after she'd taken his pen and corrected 3 of the clauses, striking out language she didn't like and writing in terms of her own. Because she was Grace Bennett, and she had never in her life signed anything she hadn't made better first, and Nathan watched her do it with something on his face that was pride and love and wonder all at once. 3 clauses, he said. I had the lawyers go over that a dozen times. Your lawyers work for you, Grace said, signing her name at last. Mine works for me. And she found 3 things she didn't like. Nathan laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind she'd almost never heard from him in the old days. The kind that only comes out of a man who's finally set something down that he'd been carrying his whole life. They walked out of the training center together as the day was ending, side by side, equals, 2 people who had each been broken by the same terrible world, and had each, against every odd, chosen to become something better than the thing that broke them. And at the door, the same kind of door that had started the whole story, Nathan paused, out of an old habit that would probably take the rest of his life to fully unlearn, and he looked at the lock. And then he looked at her, and he asked her a question. Should I lock it? Grace took his hand, and she smiled, and she gave him the answer that was the truest thing she had ever known, the answer that closed the story that a locked door had opened, the answer that a frightened, jealous, dangerous man had spent a year in an empire and his whole broken heart learning how to deserve. No, she said, we don't need locks anymore. And they walked out together into the last of the light, and behind them, for the first time in the whole long story, the door stayed open. It stayed open because neither of them was afraid of it anymore. It stayed open because love that has to lock a door isn't love at all, and they both finally knew the difference. It stayed open because Grace Bennett had walked into a locked office one stormy Monday evening as a woman somebody tried to own. And she was walking out of an open one, a year and a lifetime later, as a woman who owned herself completely and chose, freely, with nothing in the world forcing her hand, to share that freedom with the man beside her. The door stayed open, and it stayed open for good. Long after the door stayed open, after the training center filled with young workers, and the wildflowers on Grace's desk were replaced by new ones she bought herself every Friday, there remained a question underneath the whole story that neither Grace nor Nathan had ever spoken aloud, and it is the question we're sitting with now that the story is done. What is love, really? Not the word people throw around, not the feeling that comes and goes like weather, but the thing itself, the deep architecture of it. Because everything that happened between those two people, every locked door and open one, every bouquet of roses and handful of wildflowers, was in the end an argument about the answer to that single question. And the answer they arrived at, paid for in an empire and 12 years of buried grief, is worth more than any fortune Nathan Calloway ever lost. Here is the first thing the story teaches, and it is the hardest one. Love and possession are not the same thing. They feel the same, especially at the beginning, especially to a frightened person. And that is exactly why so many lives are wrecked on the confusion between them. When Nathan turned that lock on the first stormy evening, he did not experience himself as cruel. He did not think, I am now going to imprison this woman. He thought he was protecting something precious. He felt the pull toward her, the terror of losing her, the unbearable image of another man's hand on something he'd come to need. And every one of those feelings was real. And every one of them was, in some sense, love. But love pointed through the lens of fear becomes possession. And possession, no matter how tender it feels from the inside, is a cage. The tragedy of Nathan's father, the tragedy Nathan almost repeated, is that a man can love someone with his whole heart and still destroy them, because he has confused holding tight with holding safe. The story insists, again and again, that you can measure the difference by one simple test. Does your love make the other person more free or less? If it makes them less free, it is not yet love. It is fear wearing love's face. The second thing the story teaches is that the open door is harder than the locked one, and that this is precisely why it is worth more. Anyone can lock a door. It takes no courage. It takes only fear and the power to act on it. What Nathan did at the end, stepping away from the doorway, leaving Grace her exit, handing her a contract she could tear up, was 1,000 times harder than turning a lock, because it meant standing in the full blast of the possibility that she might walk away and choosing to allow it anyway. The locked door says, I cannot survive losing you, so I will remove your ability to leave. The open door says, I would rather lose you free than keep you caged, because a caged you is not you at all. And here is the paradox that sits at the very center of the story, the thing Nathan spent an empire learning. The open door is the only thing that ever actually keeps anyone. Grace came back. She came back precisely because the door was open, because Nathan had finally made it safe to choose him, because a love that does not trap you is the only love worth staying for. The tightest grip loses everything. The open hand keeps what matters. This is not sentiment. It is the oldest law of the human heart, and every locked door in the world is a bet against it, and every locked door in the world eventually loses. The third thing the story teaches is about the relationship between love and truth, and it may be the most important of all, because it is the one that separates Grace from every other person in the story. Consider what surrounds these two people. Consider Marcus, whose entire ruin grew from a lie, from 12 years of family members looking him in the eye and letting him grieve an accident that was really a murder. They told themselves they were protecting him. They believed, sincerely, that loyalty meant keeping the terrible truth away from him. And that lie, that protective, loving, well-intentioned lie, did not protect Marcus at all. It rotted inside him for 12 years and turned his grief into a bomb. This is the story's great warning about a certain kind of love, the kind that says, I love you too much to tell you the truth. That love is a poison. It treats the beloved as too fragile to bear reality, which is another way of treating them as less than fully human, and it always ends in a greater wound than the truth would have caused. And against all of that stands Grace, who understood something almost no one in the story understood, which is that love and honesty are not in tension. They are the same thing. When Agent Sloan offered her a clean escape in exchange for lies, Grace refused, not because she didn't love Nathan, but because she did. She would not lie to bury him, and she would not lie to save him, because both lies would have been a betrayal dressed as devotion. I will stand beside the man you choose to become. I will not protect the monster you refuse to leave behind. That sentence is the whole philosophy of the story in a single breath. Real love does not protect you from the consequences of who you are. Real love refuses to lie about who you are, in either direction. Because the person who lies to you about yourself, even kindly, even out of love, is keeping you from the one thing that could actually save you, which is the truth. Grace loved Nathan enough to hand the government his real records. That is a kind of love most people have never seen and would not recognize if they saw it, because it looks, from the outside, almost like betrayal. But it was the opposite of betrayal. It was the only fidelity that meant anything. She was faithful not to his comfort but to his soul. The fourth thing the story teaches concerns the terrible power of the past and how a person becomes free of it. Everyone in this story is haunted. Nathan is haunted by a mother who vanished and a father who taught him that caring is weakness. Marcus is haunted by a father who died in a fire and a family that lied about it. Even Julian, in his hollow way, is haunted by a hunger that no amount of money ever fills. And the story asks, with real seriousness, the question that every haunted person must eventually face. Are we condemned to become the thing that wounded us? Marcus nearly was. Standing in the water with a gun against his cousin's chest, he was one heartbeat away from becoming exactly what his uncle had been. A man who kills to settle the ledger of the past. And what pulled him back, in the end, was not force and not fear but truth, the truth about his own father, that his father had run toward the fire, not away from it, that his father had died trying to save people rather than trying to destroy them. Be your father's son, Grace told him, not your uncle's. And in that sentence is the answer to the question of the haunted. You are not condemned to become your wound. At every moment you are choosing which ancestor to be, which inheritance to claim, which of the many people who made you will be the one you become. The past does not decide this. You do. The fire reaches out of 12 years ago and tries to take one more soul, and you can let it, or you can refuse, and the refusing is the whole of what it means to be free. The fifth thing the story teaches is about independence, and here it turns and corrects a mistake that many people make in the opposite direction. Because it would be easy to hear this story and conclude that the lesson is simply be free, need no one, depend on nothing, stand alone. That is not the lesson. That was, in fact, Grace's own temptation, and the story is careful to show it. When Grace walked away from Nathan, she was not walking toward a life of splendid isolation. She was not proving that she needed no one. She was doing something subtler and much harder. She was making herself free so that her love, when she gave it, would be worth something. This is the distinction the whole ending turns on. A woman who stays because she cannot afford to leave has not given anything, because she had nothing to give, no real yes, only the absence of the ability to say no. Grace understood that her love could only mean something if it was freely given, and it could only be freely given if she was genuinely free, and she could only be genuinely free if she stood on her own 2 feet with her own money and her own work and her own life. So she built all of that, not to escape love, but to make her love real. Independence in this story is not the opposite of love. It is the precondition of it. You cannot truly give yourself to another person until you fully belong to yourself. The kept woman and the free woman may say the same words, may make the same gestures, may even feel the same feelings, but only one of them is actually loving, because only one of them is actually choosing. And this is why the flowers matter so much, why they run through the whole story like a thread, why the final image is Grace buying her own. Flowers in this story are the perfect symbol of the thing love is always tempted to become. A bouquet given as a claim, roses that say you are mine, flowers as territory marked, flowers as power displayed. This is love curdled into possession. Nathan's rival sends them as a threat. Marcus sends them as a message from one grave to another. Every extravagant, overwhelming arrangement in the story is about ownership. And then at the end, Grace buys herself a handful of wildflowers, the kind that grow wild in fields and belong to no one, the kind you cannot cultivate or cage. And in that single gesture, she overturns the entire meaning of every bouquet that came before. The question who bought you those flowers, which began as a jealous man's demand to know who dared to claim what he considered his, is answered at last with the only answer that sets everyone free. I bought them, nobody sent them. Nobody owns them, and nobody owns me. The woman who cannot be given flowers as a claim because she buys her own is finally free to receive them as a gift, because a gift to a free person is the only gift that is truly a gift. The sixth and final thing the story teaches is perhaps the quietest, and it lives in the small moment Near the end, when Nathan stands in a union hall and apologizes to a room full of people who hate him, not knowing that Grace is watching. Because here, the story makes its deepest claim about what it means for a person to actually change, as opposed to merely performing change for a reward. Anyone can become good when goodness is being watched and rewarded. Anyone can say the right words to win back the person they love. The test of a changed soul is what a person does in the dark, when no one who matters to them is looking, when there is no prize for doing the right thing except the doing of it. Nathan gave away his fortune, humbled himself before people who despised his name, and did the costly, unglamorous, thankless right thing while believing that the one person whose opinion he most wanted was nowhere near. And that is why Grace could finally trust him. Not because he said he had changed, not because he sent her wildflowers, but because he had become good in the dark. A love built on someone's performance is built on sand, because the performance stops the moment the audience leaves. A love built on someone's true character, the character they show when no one is watching, is the only love that lasts, because that character does not change when the room empties. So what, in the end, is love according to the story of Grace Bennett and Nathan Calloway? It is not the feeling that turned a lock on a stormy evening, though that feeling was real. It is not the fear that could not bear to see roses on a desk, though that fear was human. Love is the open door. Love is the truth told even when the truth costs everything. Love is the refusal to become the wound that made you. Love is the freedom that must exist before any real choosing can happen. Love is the gift you can only receive once you have stopped needing to be given anything. And love is the good you do in the dark, when there is no reward for it but itself. These are not soft things. Every one of them is harder than the locked door, harder than the possessive grip, harder than the comfortable lie. That is the great secret the story guards at its center. The tender, grasping, protective version of love that most people settle for is actually the easy version, the cowardly version, the version that fear can produce. The real thing is far more difficult and far more rare, because it requires you to want the other person's freedom more than your own security, their truth more than their comfort, their genuine choosing more than their mere presence. Grace Bennett walked into a locked office as a woman someone tried to own, and she walked out of an open one as a woman who owned herself and chose, freely, to share that self with another. The distance between those two doors is the whole distance of a human life well lived. It cannot be crossed by force, or wealth, or even by feeling, however sincere. It can only be crossed by the slow, costly, deliberate work of learning that to love someone is to set them free and pray they choose you, and to be worthy of their choosing by becoming, in the dark and in the light alike, a person genuinely worth choosing. Nathan learned it. Grace taught it, and lived it, and paid for it, and in the end received it back 100-fold. The door stayed open, and an open door held by two people who are each free to walk through it, and each choosing every single day not to, is the only thing in this whole uncertain world that has ever truly deserved to be called love. There is a moment that Grace Bennett returned to for the rest of her life, and it was not the warehouse, not the gun, not even the open door at the end. It was smaller than any of those. It was the 3 seconds on that first stormy evening when she stood in her own office and ordered a dangerous man to unlock a door, and waited, not knowing what he would do. She returned to it because everything the story had to teach was compressed into those 3 seconds, and because she came to understand, over the years, that every human being's life turns on some version of that exact moment, the moment when love and control stand face to face, and one of them has to give way. So it is worth asking, now that the whole story has been told, what those two people actually discovered in the long road between that first locked door and the last open one. What did their story mean? Not what happened in it, but what it was about underneath. Begin with the deepest thing, the thing that took Nathan an entire empire to learn. It is this: the people we love are not ours. They never were. This sounds obvious when it is written plainly, and yet it is the single truth that the human heart resists most fiercely, because everything in us that has ever been afraid wants desperately for it to be false. We want the people we love to be ours, to be safe because we hold them, to be permanent because we possess them. Nathan wanted this so badly that he turned a lock, the first time another man's flowers touched Grace's desk. But a person you possess is not a person you have. The moment you succeed in owning someone, you have destroyed the very thing you were trying to keep, because a person is precisely that which cannot be owned. And the instant they become your possession, they stop being the person you loved and become a hollow thing wearing their shape. This is the cruel arithmetic of control. The tighter you grip, the less you hold until at the very end, with your fist closed as hard as it will close, you find you are holding nothing at all. Nathan's father proved this with his whole life. He closed every door, owned everyone around him, ruled his family and his empire through fear, and he died alone in a fire, he said himself, having lost his wife to disappearance and his son to a coldness he taught, having gained an empire and possessed not one single human heart. That is where the locked door leads. Every time. Without exception. And now hold that against what Grace understood from the very beginning, standing in her office with the roses still fresh. When she told Nathan he did not own the people inside his building, she was not making a rule about property. She was making a claim about the nature of persons. A person is a freedom. That is what a person is, at the root. To love a person and to try to remove their freedom is a contradiction, like trying to hold water by crushing it. Because the freedom is not incidental to the person, it is the person. When Grace demanded her own room, her own lock, her unrestricted phone, her ability to leave, she was not being difficult and she was not being cold. She was teaching Nathan the only thing that could save him, which is that if he wanted her, the real her, the person, and not the possession, he would have to want her free, because there was no other version of her to have. The caged Grace would not be Grace. It would be a beautiful, obedient, hollowed-out ghost. And Nathan, to his eternal credit, eventually understood that he did not want the ghost. He wanted the woman. And the woman came only with her freedom attached, non-negotiable, the way light comes only with its speed. Here the story turns to its second great truth, which concerns the terrible seduction of protection. Because Nathan never, not once, experienced himself as a villain. This is crucial. He did not lock the door thinking, I will now control this woman. He locked it thinking, I will keep her safe. And the reason this matters so much, the reason the story dwells on it, is that the most dangerous cages in the world are not built by cruelty. They are built by love. They are built by people who genuinely, sincerely want to protect someone and who cannot tell the difference between protecting a person and imprisoning them. This is the confusion that ruins more love than cruelty ever has, because cruelty announces itself and can be resisted, while protective control disguises itself as devotion and slips past every guard. How many people have been suffocated by someone who loved them too much to let them breathe? How many lives have been quietly narrowed, over years, by a partner or a parent whose every restriction came wrapped in the words, it's for your own good? Nathan was on the road to becoming one of those people. And Grace's whole achievement, the thing she did that no one else in his life had ever done, was to hold up a mirror and force him to see that the hand he thought was sheltering her was actually closing around her throat. The moment you decide that keeping me safe means keeping me locked in a room, she told him, you stop being the man protecting me and you become the thing you're protecting me from. There is no more important sentence in the entire story because it names the exact place where love goes wrong, the precise hinge on which a devoted heart swings from tenderness into tyranny without ever noticing it has moved. And how do you tell the difference? In your own life, in your own love. The story gives a test, and it is beautiful in its simplicity. Protection that respects freedom asks. Control that is curdled into ownership commands. Watch the language. When Nathan learned to say whether you meet him is your decision, instead of I forbid you to see him, he had crossed from one country into the other. The words cost him agony. Grace saw the agony and honored it. But the words themselves were the whole revolution. Because a person who asks has accepted that the other person is free, and a person who commands has not. Real love lives entirely in the asking. It says, here is what I fear, here is what I want, here is what I would beg of you, and then it falls silent and waits, because it knows it has no right to the answer, only the right to hope. The lover who commands has forgotten that the beloved is a person. The lover who asks remembers it in every syllable. The third truth the story carries is darker and concerns the long reach of pain. The way a wound left in the dark does not heal but ferments. Marcus is the story's great study in this. For 12 years he carried a grief that had been poisoned by a lie, and the poison was not the death of his father, terrible as that was. The poison was the lie about it. His family looked him in the eye and let him grieve an accident when the truth was murder. And that gap between what he was told and what was real became a wound that could not close because it had a lie lodged in it like glass in a cup. And here the story says something that every person who has ever been protected by a kind lie needs to hear. The lie told to spare you is not a gift. It is a theft. It steals from you the one thing that could let you heal, which is the truth, and in its place it leaves a wound that festers for years and finally detonates. Everyone who lied to Marcus believed they were being kind. They were being cruel in the deepest possible way, because they treated him as too weak to bear reality. And a person treated as too weak to bear reality is a person who has been quietly told they are less than fully human. The kind lie is contempt wearing the mask of mercy. And its fruit in this story was a man standing in floodwater with a gun against his cousin's chest. A bomb 12 years in the making, assembled entirely out of good intentions and withheld truth. This is why Grace's refusal to lie, at the very end, to Sloane and to Nathan both, is the moral summit of the whole story. She had watched up close what a kind lie does to a person over 12 years. She had seen the bomb it built. And so when she was offered every incentive to lie against Nathan for immunity, or to lie for him out of love, she refused both. Because she had learned the lesson Marcus's whole family failed to learn. You do not love someone by lying to them about who they are. The love that lies to protect is the same love that destroyed Marcus. And Grace would rather hand Nathan's own records to the government and let him face the truth of what he had done than protect him with the poison that had already ruined one man in this story. I will stand beside the man you choose to become, she said. I will not protect the monster you refuse to leave behind. Read that sentence as the direct answer to the tragedy of Marcus. Marcus's family protected the monster and lost the man. Grace refused to protect the monster precisely so that the man could live. That is the difference between the love that heals and the love that rots. And it is a difference of exactly one thing, whether it is willing to tell the truth. Now come to the fourth truth, which is the one that redeems the whole bleak machinery of the past. And it is the truth of the choosing self. Because a story so full of inheritance, of fathers passing their poison to sons, of wounds passing from generation to generation, could easily conclude that we are trapped, that we become what made us, that the fire 12 years ago was always going to consume one more soul. And the story stares directly at that possibility, in the person of Marcus with the gun, and then it refuses it. What pulls Marcus back from the edge is the discovery of a different ancestor to become. His father did not light the fire. His father ran toward it to save people he barely knew. And in that fact, Marcus is offered a choice that every haunted person is offered, though few ever see it clearly. You contain more than one inheritance. You are made of many people, and some of them were cruel, and some of them were brave, and the past does not get to decide which of them you become. You do. Be your father's son, Grace told him, not your uncle's, and in that instruction is the entire secret of human freedom. We are not condemned to repeat the harm done to us. At every moment, we are choosing which of our ancestors to claim, which voice to answer, which of the many hands that shaped us will be the one we let guide our own. The fire reaches out of the past and tries to make one more monster, and you can let it, or you can refuse. And the refusing is not a single dramatic act, but 1,000 quiet choices every day for the rest of your life. Nathan chose to refuse his father. Marcus, at the last possible instant, chose to refuse his uncle and claim his father instead. And in refusals, the story locates the only freedom that finally matters, the freedom to not become what hurt you. And this brings us, at the end of all things, back to the flowers and to the fifth truth, which gathers all the others into a single image. Watch what flowers mean across the whole story, and you will see the entire philosophy of it bloom. Flowers begin as weapons. Roses sent to threaten, roses that say I can reach what you love, flowers as a message from a murderer to a grave, flowers as territory, flowers as ownership, flowers as the closed fist of possession made beautiful and handed across a desk. Every bouquet in the long middle of the story is love turned into a claim. And then at the very end, a woman buys herself a handful of wildflowers and the entire meaning inverts. Wildflowers cannot be owned. They grow where they grow. They belong to no one. They are the opposite of the cultivated, controlled, hothouse rose sent to mark a possession. And when Grace buys her own, she answers the question that started everything, the jealous demand to know who bought her those flowers, with the only answer that frees every person in the story. I bought them myself. The woman who buys her own flowers cannot be given flowers as a claim, and therefore, for the first time, she is free to receive them as a gift. This is the whole thing. A gift can only be given to someone who does not need it, because a gift given to someone who cannot refuse it is not a gift but a transaction, a leash, a debt. Grace made herself free, made herself whole, made herself a woman who needed nothing from Nathan, and only then, standing in complete independence, was she able to receive his love as what love must always be to be real. A gift between two people who are each entirely free to walk away and who choose freely not to. That is the final meaning of the open door. Not that the people we love might leave, though they might. The open door means that when they stay, their staying is real. A love that locks the door can never know whether it is loved because it has removed the possibility of no, and a yes that cannot be a no is not a yes at all. It is only the absence of escape. Nathan spent his whole life trying to guarantee love by removing the freedom to refuse it, and in doing so he guaranteed that he would never receive a single real yes as long as he lived. It was only when he stepped away from the door, only when he made himself vulnerable to losing her completely, only when he handed her a contract she could tear up and an exit she could take, that Grace's return became worth anything. She came back through an open door. It is the only kind of return that means she chose him. And a chosen love, a love that walked through an open door when it could have walked away, is the only love in the entire uncertain world that has ever been worth having. So in the end, the story leaves us with a single, difficult teaching, and it runs against almost everything fear whispers to us about how to keep the people we love. Do not lock the door. Do not grip. Do not lie to protect. Do not confuse your fear for their good. Do not try to become their safety by becoming their cage. Instead, tell them the truth, even when it costs you everything. Set them free, even when your whole body screams to hold them. Become worthy of their choosing, in the dark and in the light, when they are watching and when they are not. And then open the door and stand back and let them go and pray and wait to see whether they return. It is the hardest thing a human being can do with another human being. It is also the only thing that has ever deserved the name of love. Grace Bennett and Nathan Calloway learned it the hard way, across an empire and a warehouse, and 12 years of buried grief and 6 months of silence that nearly broke them both. And what they found on the far side of all of it was the plainest and most impossible truth the heart can hold. That you keep only what you are willing to lose. That you are loved only to the degree that you are free to be unloved. And that the open door, held by two people who each choose every single day to remain, is the whole of what we mean, or ought to mean, when we dare to use the word love at all.